Picture the high desert of southeastern New Mexico at the very end of a summer day. The land lies flat and wide in every direction, a great open plain the color of dust and dry grass, and the heat that pressed down through the long afternoon is loosening now, lifting off the ground in a slow exhale as the sun lowers itself toward the western hills. The air is thin and clean and very dry. The way air is at 3,500 feet of elevation, and it carries the smell of warm earth and creosote and the faint resin of mesquite. Somewhere a windmill turns slowly on its tower, the blades catching the last light and throwing it back in soft flashes, and the only sound for miles is the small, steady creak of it and the dry whisper of the breeze moving through the scrub. This is the country where the story we will follow tonight began. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no thing to fix in your memory, no task that cannot wait until morning. Let the words come slowly, at whatever pace the night allows, and let yourself drift down gently towards sleep. The story is an old one now, and it is patient, and it is in no hurry at all. This is the high desert of the Pecos Valley in Chaves County, in the southeastern corner of New Mexico, and it is worth picturing carefully before we go any further, because the land itself is part of what we have come to understand. You may think of New Mexico, if you have never been, as a place of red rock and tall mountains and adobe villages, and there is some of that far to the north and west, but this corner of the state is different. This is the southern edge of the Great Plains, where the flatness that begins up in Canada comes rolling all the way down through the heart of the continent and runs at last into the high desert of the Southwest. It is a place of enormous distances and very few people. The horizon sits low and far away on every side, an unbroken line where the pale land meets the pale sky, and the sky above it is the largest thing you will ever see, a great blue dome that goes nearly white with light at midday and then, in the evening, fills slowly with color from one edge to the other, orange and rose and violet, the way it is filling now. The town at the center of all of this is Roswell. It sits on the western side of the Pecos River, which runs down out of the mountains to the north and winds its slow brown way south across the plain toward Texas, one of the only threads of moving water in all that dry country. Roswell is an old town by the standards of the West, founded in 1869 when a man from Nebraska named Van Smith built 2 adobe buildings along a creek and named the place after his father. It began as a stopping point on the great cattle trails. The good night-loving trail came through here, the dusty road along which enormous herds were driven north to market, and it grew into a supply town for the ranchers who spread out across the open range in every direction. The cattleman John Chisholm kept his headquarters just south of town, at a place called South Spring Ranch, and at the height of his empire he grazed tens of thousands of head of cattle across these plains. Later, when men discovered that there was water hidden beneath the dry ground, great reserves of artesian water that would rise on its own when a well was sunk, the town bloomed into something more, orchards and alfalfa fields and the raising of sheep for wool, all of it watered up out of the earth in a place that the rain itself had nearly forgotten. Because the rain does nearly forget this country. Roswell sits in a semi-arid climate on the northern reach of the Chihuahuan Desert, and it receives only 12 or 14 inches of rain in a whole year, most of it arriving in the short, violent thunderstorms of late summer. The monsoon storms that build in the heat of the afternoon stack themselves into tall, dark towers over the plain and let down their water in sudden hammering bursts before moving on and leaving the ground steaming. The rest of the year is dry and bright. The sun shines here on most of the days of the calendar, a clean high desert sun, and the air holds almost no moisture, so that the heat of the day gives way quickly to the cool of the night, and the stars, when they come in their thousands. It is a hard country to make a living in and a beautiful one to look at, and the people who settled it learned to measure their lives by water and by weather, and by the long, slow turning of the seasons across an enormous sky. Out beyond the town, the ranches run for miles in every direction, vast spreads of land where a single family might hold thousands of acres, because it takes a great deal of this dry ground to feed even a small herd. The land between the ranch houses is open and rolling, covered in short, dry grama grass and dotted with the low, dark shapes of mesquite and the silver-green tangle of creosote bush. There are shallow draws and dry watercourses cut into the earth. The people here call them arroyos, the channels where the rare rainwater runs and floods and then sinks away, leaving the sand rippled in the banks raw. There are outcrops of pale rock and stretches of caliche, the hard white crust of mineral that forms just beneath the surface in deserts like this one. And over all of it lies that immense quiet, the quiet of a place where you can stand and turn in a full, slow circle and see no other living soul, no road, no light, only the land and the grass and the sky and the wind. The light out here is a thing worth pausing on, because the light is half of what the desert is. In the long middle of the day, it comes down hard and flat and white, flattening the land, draining the color out of everything, pressing the heat into the ground until the far edges of the plain shimmer and dissolve and the horizon swims. But morning and evening are different. In the first hour of the day, the light comes in low and golden from the east and rakes across the land sideways, and every small thing throws a long shadow, every clump of grass, every fence post, every stone, so that the whole flat country is suddenly textured and alive, dimpled with light and dark, and the dew, if there is any, glitters for a few minutes before the sun burns it off. And in the last hour, the hour we are standing in now, the same thing happens in reverse, the light going gold and then amber and then deep red as it lowers, the shadows running out long and blue across the grass, the western mountains, the Sierra Blanca and the Capitan Range, off 40 miles or more to the west, going purple and then black against the burning sky. People who grow up in this country carry that light in them all their lives. It is a particular thing, the light of the high desert, and it does not look quite like the light anywhere else. And the weather out on these open plains is its own kind of presence, something you watch the way a sailor watches the sea. For most of the year, the sky is simply enormous and empty and blue, but in the heat of summer, the great thunderheads build in the afternoons, rising up off the western mountains in towers of brilliant white that climb thousands of feet into the sky and darken at their bases to a deep blue-black. You can see them coming from an hour away across the flat land, can watch the gray curtains of rain trailing down beneath them, can smell the rain on the wind before it ever reaches you, that sharp green mineral smell of water hitting hot dry ground, which the people here, like desert people everywhere, love more than almost any smell there is. And then the storm arrives and the lightning steps down out of the clouds in white forks that strike the open ground, and the thunder rolls flat and enormous across the plain with nothing to stop it, and the rain comes hard for a little while, filling the arroyos with sudden brown water, and then it passes, moving off east, and the sun comes back out, and the land steams, and the air is washed clean and cool for a few precious hours. It was a night of such storms, in the middle of June in 1947, that begins everything we will follow tonight. Now hold that picture, the open ranch country in the failing light, and let us place upon the map one more thing, because it matters greatly to the story, and it is the reason this remote and quiet corner of the desert became, for a time, the most talked-about place on Earth. Just south of the town of Roswell, in those years after the war, there was an airfield. It was called Roswell Army Airfield, and it was no ordinary base. It was the home of the 509th Bomb Group, and in the summer of 1947, the 509th was the most singular military unit in the entire world. It was the only group of men anywhere who were trained and equipped to deliver an atomic bomb. You must understand what that meant in that year in that place. The war had ended only 2 summers before, ended in the blinding light of 2 atomic bombs dropped on the cities of Japan, and it was the 509th that had dropped them. The aircraft that carried the first bomb to Hiroshima, the B-29 called the Enola Gay, belonged to this group. The men who had flown those missions had come, after the war, here, to this quiet airfield on the high desert plain, outside a small ranching town in New Mexico. They had arrived from a tiny island in the western Pacific called Tinian in November of 1945, and they had settled in, and they had gone on being what they were. The only atomic strike force on the planet, the sharpened point of the most powerful weapon human beings had ever made, kept here in the middle of all this empty land, far from any coast, far from any enemy, far from almost everything. And so the desert held a strange double character in those days, though the people who lived in it went about their ordinary business and thought little of it. On the surface there were the ranches and the sheep and the cattle, the windmills turning, the slow brown river, the old cattle town with its courthouse and its churches and its dusty streets, a way of life that had hardly changed in 70 years. And just beneath that, woven invisibly through it, there was the most advanced and most secret military capability in the history of the world, sitting on a runway south of town behind a fence. The men of the 509th drank coffee in the same cafes as the ranchers. Their children went to the same schools. Most of what they did was secret, and the town did not ask, because that was how it was in those years, so soon after a war, in a country that had learned not to ask. New Mexico itself held more such secrets than almost anywhere, for it was here only 2 years before, at a remote spot in the desert to the west called Trinity, that the first atomic bomb of all had been tested, lighting up the pre-dawn sky with a false and terrible sunrise. And it was at Los Alamos, up in the mountains to the north, that the bomb had been designed, in a secret laboratory in a place that did not officially exist. The high desert of New Mexico, in the middle years of the 1940s, was a landscape of enormous open emptiness laid over enormous hidden purpose. It was a place where the sky was watched, and where strange lights and strange sounds were not always to be spoken of, and where the line between what was known and what was kept quiet ran invisibly across the dry grass and the mesquite and the wide, flat plain. It is worth holding all of that lightly in your mind as you settle, not as a thing to puzzle over, but as a kind of background against which the story will play, the way you might notice the furniture of a room growing dim as the light goes, and let it grow dim and not mind. Because the story we will follow over the coming hours did not begin on the airfield, behind the fence, among the secret men. It began, as so many of the largest things do, in the most ordinary way imaginable, out on the open ranch country, with a working man riding his land after a storm. Some 75 miles to the northwest of Roswell, up in the wide, empty grazing country toward a tiny community called Corona, in the next county over Lincoln County, the old county of the cattle wars and the gunfighters, of Billy the Kid and Lincoln Town, there was a sheep ranch known as the Foster Ranch. It was managed by a rancher named William Brazel, whom everyone called Mac, a quiet, hard-working man who lived the hard, quiet life of that country, riding out across the spread to check the sheep and the fences and the water. It was big, lonely land up there, even by the standards of New Mexico, the kind of land where you might ride for an hour and see nothing but grass and sky and the occasional startled jackrabbit, where the nearest neighbor was many miles off and the nearest town little more than a few buildings at a crossroads. And it was here on this land, sometime around the middle of June in 1947, after a night of the violent summer thunderstorms that roll across that plain, after lightning and wind and a hard burst of rain in the dark, that Mac Brazel rode out across one of the pastures and found, scattered across the dry ground, something he had never seen before. We will go to that morning carefully in its own time, and we will look at exactly what he found and exactly what he did and exactly what happened next, slowly and from every side, the way you look at anything that has been argued over for the better part of a century. We will not rush it. There is a great deal to it, far more than the few bright words the legend usually allows, and most of what is interesting in it lives in the patient detail, in the timeline, and who said what and when in the documents and the recollections and the long, strange afterlife of a thing found in a field. For now it is enough to know only that it began here in this country, under this sky, with this man, after that storm. A scatter of unfamiliar material across a few hundred yards of pasture. A shallow gouge in the earth several hundred feet long, as though something had come down at an angle and dragged. A rancher standing in the morning light, turning a strange light fragment over in his hands, wondering what on earth it was and where it could have come from. That small, ordinary moment, out in the emptiest part of an empty land, would grow over the years that followed into the most famous unidentified object story in the world. A story that would attach itself to this town so completely that the name Roswell would come to mean, for millions of people who could not find New Mexico on a map, not a ranching town or an airfield or stretch of high desert, but a single idea. A single question that has refused for nearly 80 years to lie down and be still. What was it that fell on the high desert in the summer of 1947? What did the rancher find, and what did the men from the airfield collect, and why did the Army say one thing on one day and another thing on the next? Over the long hours ahead, we will follow that question patiently, the way you follow a dry watercourse across the desert to see where it leads, through the ranch and the discovery, through the press release and the swift correction, through the witnesses and the silence and the official accounts and the decades of telling and retelling. And we will weigh, as honestly and as gently as we can, what the evidence actually shows. Some of those who told the story over the years would carry it far beyond that one ranch in Lincoln County. They would speak of a second site, far away across the state, out on the plains of San Agustin, a long flat basin in the mountains of western New Mexico, more than 150 miles from the Foster Ranch, where, in some versions of the tale, a craft was said to have come down whole. That part of the story is disputed and unverified, and we will treat it as carefully and as gently as all the rest when we come to it. For now it is only worth knowing that the land itself, the the great empty high country of New Mexico, is wide enough and lonely enough and strange enough that stories settle into it the way water settles into the dry arroyos, finding the low places, pooling, sinking in, rising again somewhere unexpected. It is that kind of country. It always has been. But not tonight and not yet. Tonight we are only arriving. Tonight we are only standing in the cooling air at the end of a desert day, getting our bearings, letting our eyes adjust to the bigness of the place, feeling how far the horizon is and how high the sky goes and how deep the quiet runs. The story will keep. It is kept for the better part of 80 years already, and it will keep until the next quiet hour. So let the desert hold you for a while. The sun is below the hills now, and the long shadows have run out across the plain and joined together and become the dusk, and the heat is lifting away off the ground and rising into the dark, and the coolness is coming up out of the earth to replace it. The windmill turns slowly on its tower, creaking, slowing, as the evening breeze begins to fail. Far off, a kite calls once and is answered, and then the silence comes back and folds itself over everything. The mesquite and the creosote are only dark, low shapes now in the failing light, and the dry grass moves a little and then goes still. The pale rock has gone gray, and the arroyos have filled with shadow, and the long flat land is settling. The way land settles at the end of a hot day, releasing its warmth slowly into the great cooling dome of the sky. And the stars are beginning. Out here, far from any town, far from any light but the first faint lamps of a distant ranch house. They come quickly once the color has drained from the west, first one or two, low and bright and steady, and then a scattering, and then more until the whole enormous sky is thick with them. More than you have ever seen from any city, close and clear and uncountable in the dry desert air. They are the same stars the ranchers watched, lying out on summer nights when the house was too hot to sleep in. They are the same stars the men of the airfield watched, walking the runway in the dark. They are the same stars that wheeled slowly over the high desert on the night of that storm in June of 1947, when the lightning walked across the plain and the rain came down hard in the dark, and something, by the morning, lay scattered across a sheep pasture in the empty country up toward Corona. There is nothing in that picture for you to fear. It is only a desert at night, vast and quiet and beautiful, breathing out the last of the day's heat under a sky full of stars. The story that begins here is a human story, full of real people and real places and real questions, and we will hold it the way we hold all such stories on these long nights, slowly, with care, in no hurry to force it into an answer it may not have. There will be time for all of it. There will be the ranch and the rancher and the strange material in the field. There will be the airfield and the officers and the things they said. There will be the long argument of the years. All of it is waiting, patient as the desert itself, out there in the dark just ahead of us. But for now, let it wait. For now there is only the high desert at night, and the cool air coming up out of the ground, and the windmill gone still on its tower, and the great wheel of stars turning slowly overhead. Let the horizon disappear into the dark. Let the distances soften and close. Let the wide, flat land hold you the way it has held everything that ever crossed it, lightly, quietly, without asking anything in return. Sleep comes the way the stars come over the desert, one at a time at first, and then more, and then all at once, the whole sky of it, and you are inside it before you know it has arrived. Let it come. Let the warm, dry land breathe slowly beneath you in the dark, and let the high, clean air settle cool and soft over everything. The story will be here when the next quiet hour opens, patient as the plain, waiting in the gray light of a New Mexico morning, out on the empty grazing country up toward Corona, where a rancher is saddling his horse to ride out across the wet pasture and see what the storm left behind. But that is for the next quiet hour. For now, only the desert, only the stars, only the long, slow breathing of the land beneath the wide and ancient sky. Picture a small airplane high over the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, late on a clear afternoon in early summer. The light is long and golden, the kind of light that comes at 3 o'clock on a cloudless June day, and the air at 9,000 feet is cool and very smooth. Below, the land falls away in dark folds of evergreen, ridge after ridge of forest going blue with distance, and ahead, rising out of all of it, is Mount Rainier, enormous, snow-shouldered, catching the sun on its white upper slopes so that it seems almost to glow against the deep blue of the high sky. The little plane drones along steadily, a single engine turning over up front, the cockpit warm and bright, and the man at the controls has the windows clean and the whole sky to himself. There is nothing urgent in this moment. It is only a fine afternoon, and a good airplane, and a mountain in the distance, and a man flying home. Let yourself sit in that cockpit a while, in the warm sun and the steady hum, and let the day be as ordinary as it was just before it stopped being ordinary at all. The man's name is Kenneth Arnold. He is 32 years old, a businessman from Boise, Idaho, who sells fire suppression equipment up and down the Pacific Northwest, flying his own plane from town to town the way another salesman might drive a car. He is an experienced pilot, careful and unexcitable, with thousands of hours behind him. The plane is a Call-Air A2, a small high-winged machine built for exactly this kind of mountain work. On this afternoon, the 24th of June, 1947, he has finished his business in the town of Chehalis and is flying east toward Yakima, and he has decided to spend an hour of daylight on a small detour. A Marine Corps transport plane, a C-46, had gone down somewhere in the rugged country around Mount Rainier, and there is a reward posted $5,000 for anyone who can find the wreckage. Arnold knows these mountains. He thinks he might as well look. So he banks toward the high peaks and begins to quarter the slopes, eyes down, searching the dark timber and the snowfields for the glint of torn metal that would mean a crash. He is looking, in other words, for something perfectly explainable, a lost airplane, a thing made of aluminum and rivets, sitting broken on a mountainside where he could point to it and collect his reward and fly home. He's not looking for anything strange at all. And then at about 3 in the afternoon, a flash of light goes across his eyes, bright, sudden, like sunlight bouncing off a mirror. It startles him. His first thought is the thought any cautious pilot would have, that he has nearly been surprised by another aircraft, that some plane has slipped in close without his seeing it. He looks around quickly, scanning the sky for whatever threw that light. There is only one other airplane in view, a DC-4 airliner far off and behind him, much too distant to have flashed across his windscreen like that. And then the flash comes again, and this time he finds the source of it off to his left and to the north, flying along the high spine of the Cascade Range between Mount Rainier and Mount Baker. He sees a chain of objects, 9 of them strung out in a long line, flying very fast and catching the sun in bright pulses as they go. Sit with what that would be like to be alone in a small plane in a clean sky, expecting nothing, and to find your eye caught by 9 bright shapes moving along the mountains at a speed you cannot quite make sense of. Arnold does not panic. He is a pilot. His instinct is to measure. He looks for wings because everything that flies has wings and he cannot find any. He looks for tails, the upright fin that every aircraft of 1947 carries at its rear, and there are no tails either. The objects are thin and flat, he will say afterward, and they catch the light the way a polished surface catches it, flashing as they tip and bank. They fly in a strange weaving line, dipping and rising, threading along the contour of the ridges, and one of them, he is careful to note this, is shaped differently from the rest, more like a crescent, with a small domed bump near its center. They do not fly the way airplanes fly. They flutter and tip and skip, and the motion of them is so unlike anything in his experience that years later he will still be reaching for words to describe it. He thinks of geese, of the way a flock of geese will string itself out in a loose line and weave as it goes. He thinks of the tail of a kite snapping in the wind. He notices that as each object banks, it flashes, a bright wink of reflected sun running down the chain one after another, and that between the flashes the things go almost invisible against the snow and the sky, so that he is forever finding them and losing them again. He estimates their size as best he can against the distant airliner he can still see far behind him, and reckons each one to be perhaps the size of a passenger plane or a little smaller. He has the strong impression that they are flying not at random but together, with the loose discipline of a formation, as though something guided them along the line of the peaks. Being a careful man, he does what a careful pilot does, he times them. He has a clock in the instrument panel and he knows the mountains beneath them, and he watches the chain of objects pass from one landmark to the next, from near Mount Rainier down toward Mount Adams, a distance he knows to be roughly 50 miles. They cover it by his clock in about 1 minute and 42 seconds. He does the arithmetic later on the ground, and the number it gives him is so large he hardly trusts it, something like 1,700 miles an hour. This is 1947. No aircraft in the world flies at 1,700 miles an hour. The sound barrier, the wall of speed that pilots have been pressing against for years, will not be officially broken in level flight until that October, months in the future, in a rocket plane over the California desert. Arnold knows all of this. The number unsettles him, and so, being conservative by nature, he rounds it down. He will tell people 1,200 miles an hour, as if a slightly smaller impossible number might be easier to believe. Either way, it is faster than anything that should be in that sky. He watches the 9 bright shapes flicker away to the south until they are gone, and then he flies on to Yakima with something in his chest that he does not have a name for. It is worth pausing here in the quiet after the sighting to notice how reasonable Arnold is being. He does not think he has seen visitors from another world. That idea is barely available to anyone in 1947. It is not yet a thing people reach for. His own first guesses are earthly ones. Perhaps these are some new kind of military aircraft, some secret project being tested in the mountains, guided missiles, jet planes of a design he has not been told about. The war has been over for less than 2 years, and everyone knows that the war produced extraordinary machines in secret, the great roaring bombers and the strange new jets and the bombs that ended it all, and it is entirely natural to suppose that the Army is flying something new and is simply not telling civilian pilots about it. That is Arnold's working theory as he climbs out of his plane in Yakima and starts trying to tell people what he saw. He is not selling a mystery. He is reporting an anomaly, the way an honest witness reports a thing he cannot explain, and he half expects someone to laugh and hand him the simple answer. No one has the simple answer. He talks to other pilots on the ground at Yakima, and they listen, and they do not know what to make of it either. He half wonders for a while whether the objects might have been some kind of guided missile, and he says so. He turns the idea over the way you turn over stone, looking for the ordinary explanation underneath. But missiles do not weave like geese, and missiles do not come in flocks of 9, and the explanation will not quite settle into place. He cannot let it go. That night and into the next day he keeps coming back to it, replaying the flashes and the skipping motion behind his eyes, and the more he replays it, the stranger it becomes rather than the more familiar. The next day he flies on to Pendleton in eastern Oregon, and word of what he has seen has somehow gotten there ahead of him, and a small crowd of curious people is waiting. And it is here in Pendleton that the story leaves the realm of one pilot's strange afternoon and begins to become something much larger. Because in Pendleton there is a newspaper, the East Oregonian, and there are 2 reporters who will sit down with Kenneth Arnold and write the few hundred words that change everything. Their names are Bill Biquette and Nolan Skiff. They are local newspapermen doing the ordinary work of local newspapermen, listening to a credible witness, taking down what he says, trying to put it into plain language for the morning paper. Arnold tells them what he told the pilots at Yakima, 9 objects flying fast along the mountains, thin and flat and without wings or tails, moving in that strange, skipping, fluttering way. And then he reaches for the comparison he keeps coming back to, the one image that captures the motion of the things. They flew, he says, erratically like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. Picture that for a moment, because it is the hinge on which the whole century will turn. A flat stone or a saucer sent skimming low across the surface of a pond, the way a child skips one touching down and lifting, dancing along the water in a series of quick light skips. That is what Arnold means. He is describing the way the objects moved. He is not, in that moment, describing their shape at all. But language is a slippery thing, and a good phrase has a will of its own. Somewhere in the writing of the story, and the exact moment has been argued over ever since, the saucer slid free of the motion and attached itself instead to the form. Skiff's early account spoke of saucer-like aircraft. When Biquette filed the story to the Associated Press, the wire service that carried news across the whole country, the words that went out described 9 bright saucer-like objects. And from there it was a very short step, taken by headline writers in newsrooms from coast to coast, none of whom had spoken to Arnold, to the 2 words that would outlast everyone involved, flying saucers. By the time the phrase reached the public, it had quietly transformed his meaning. People read it and pictured not the skipping of the objects, but the shape of them, round, flat, plate-like discs sailing through the sky. Arnold himself would spend the rest of his life trying, without success, to correct the record. He had compared a motion to a saucer skipping on water, and the world had heard that the saucers themselves were flying. The misunderstanding became the legend became the language. And we use that language still, all these years later. Every time anyone anywhere says the words flying saucer, they are repeating, without knowing it, a small mistranslation made in a newspaper office in Pendleton, Oregon, in the last days of June, 1947. The Associated Press dispatch went out and was everywhere within a day. The Chicago Sun ran a headline calling them supersonic flying saucers sighted by an Idaho pilot. Newspapers across the country picked it up because it was, for the moment, the perfect story, strange, vivid, attached to a credible and respectable witness, and impossible to dismiss out of hand. A radio interviewer who spoke with Arnold on the 26th of June told him that the Associated Press and the United Press all over the nation had been chasing the story, that it was on every newscast and in every newspaper the man knew of. Within 48 hours, a businessman's quiet detour over the mountains had become a national sensation. And here, gently, is where the chapter truly opens out, because the remarkable thing is not only what Kenneth Arnold saw. The remarkable thing is what happened next, all across America, in the warm weeks that followed. People began to look up, and having begun to look up, they began to see. It started as a trickle and became a flood. Within days of the Arnold story breaking, reports of flying saucers began arriving from town after town, state after state, until the whole country seemed to be tilting its head back toward the summer sky. By the 4th of July, Independence Day, when much of the nation was already outdoors in the evening watching for fireworks, faces turned up, the sightings had spread across 11 states and into 2 Canadian provinces. The crew of a United Airlines flight over Idaho reported 4 or 5 smooth, disc-shaped objects pacing their airliner in the dusk. In Twin Falls, a group of 60 picnickers said they watched 35 discs cross the sky together. At Hayden Lake, 200 people described a single object hanging in the air for half an hour. By the 6th of July, sightings had been reported in some 31 states. The reports came in their hundreds. Historians counting them afterward would document at least 800 separate accounts in those few weeks, and some estimates run into the thousands. They crested around the 7th of July, and then over the following week slowly tapered away, the way a fever breaks. For perhaps 2 weeks in the summer of 1947, the United States looked up at its own sky and was not entirely sure what was in it. It is easy from a great distance to be dismissive of this, to call it mass hysteria and leave it there, as though that explained anything. But it is gentler and truer to try to feel your way into the moment, into what it was actually like to be an ordinary American in that particular summer, and to understand why a sky full of saucers felt, to so many people, like a thing that could plausibly be real. The war had ended less than 2 years before. Almost every family in the country had been touched by it, and the country that came out the other side was a different country than the one that had gone in, richer, more powerful, and far more uneasy. It had learned in the span of a single decade that the impossible was routinely possible. It had watched aircraft go from canvas and wire to screaming metal jets. It had watched, only 2 summers earlier, 2 cities in Japan vanish under a new kind of bomb that drew its power from the splitting of the atom itself. A weapon that, before it was used, most people would have called pure fantasy, the stuff of pulp magazines. The lesson of those years had sunk deep into the national mind, that scientists and engineers working in secret could conjure powers that seemed like magic, and that the government would not necessarily tell you about them until it chose to. So when a respectable pilot reported objects flying at impossible speeds, the most natural thought in the world was not that they came from another planet. It was that they came from a laboratory. Perhaps they were ours, some new secret weapon being tested over the empty mountains of the West. Or perhaps, and this was the colder thought, they were not ours at all. For the new fear had already begun to settle over the country, the long fear that would shape the next 40 years. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was curdling into something else. That very spring, in March of 1947, the president had stood before Congress and announced the doctrine that would bear his name, committing the United States to resisting Soviet pressure wherever it appeared. The phrase Cold War was just entering the language. The atomic monopoly that America held would not last, everyone sensed that, and the question of what the Soviets were building and how far ahead or behind they were hung over everything. So among the flying saucer reports of that summer ran a thread of genuine military anxiety. Could the discs be Soviet aircraft, captured German technology turned eastward, probing American skies, perhaps studying the very atomic installations scattered across that empty western desert? The Army Air Forces did not laugh the question off. Reports came in from credible people, the lieutenant governor of Idaho among them, and across the country at key air bases, fighters were quietly kept ready, just in case the objects in the sky turned out to be the leading edge of something far more terrestrial and far more dangerous. The newspapers that printed the saucer stories also printed on the same pages warnings about the possibility of atomic war. The two anxieties lived side by side, and they fed one another, and the saucers became a kind of vessel into which a frightened and bewildered nation could pour all of it at once. There was something else at work too, quieter and more human, woven into the texture of the newspaper culture of the day. This was a country that read. The newspaper was the heartbeat of every town, the morning ritual and the evening one, and the wire services, the Associated Press, the United Press, stitched the towns together into a single nervous system, so that a strange story filed in eastern Oregon could be on a breakfast table in Georgia within a day. A vivid phrase, once loosed onto the wire, could colonize the entire continent almost overnight, and flying saucers was a very vivid phrase. Once the words existed, once everyone had read them and pictured the bright round discs sailing overhead, the words themselves began to shape what people saw. A glint of metal on a high-flying plane, a weather balloon catching the evening sun, a flock of birds turning in the light, the planet Venus burning low and bright on the horizon, a trick of cloud and sun that any other summer would have gone unremarked. Now all of it had a name and a category waiting to receive it. The mind is a pattern-finding thing, and you tend to find the patterns you've been taught to look for. 1947 had just been taught in 2 words exactly what to look for. And so it looked, and so it found. None of which means that every person who reported a saucer that summer was mistaken, or foolish, or lying. Most of them were ordinary, honest people doing the very human thing of trying to make sense of something odd they had genuinely seen, a light, a shape, a movement that did not fit. Some of what they saw surely had simple explanations they never learned, some perhaps did not. That is the soft and enduring strangeness of the whole season, that out of the hundreds of reports, a residue always remained that no one could quite tidy away, and that residue would keep the question alive for decades to come, long after the summer itself had faded. But the wave as a whole, the sudden, contagious, nationwide blossoming of saucers in the sky, was less about the sky than about the people looking at it. It was a portrait of a country at a particular moment, powerful and frightened, dazzled by its own technology and unnerved by it, peering up into the blue and seeing reflected there its own deepest hopes and fears about what the new age might be bringing. And Kenneth Arnold, the man who started it all, never wanted any of this. He had seen 9 bright things flutter along a mountain range on a fine afternoon, and he had reported it honestly, the way an honest man does, and the report had escaped him entirely and grown into something he could neither control nor recognize. He spent years being misquoted, being laughed at and lionized by turns, trying patiently to explain that he had described a motion and not a shape, that the saucers had never been saucers at all. 30 years later, he would say, with a weariness you can almost hear, that he had suffered some embarrassment here and there from the misquotes. He had wanted in the end only to be believed and then left alone. He was a careful man who had seen something strange and told the truth about it, and the truth had been carried off on the wind of the wire services and turned into a legend that would outlive him by generations. We will leave him there in the warm light of that late June afternoon, climbing down from his little plane in Pendleton, with the whole impossible summer about to break over his head and the rest of the century not far behind him. The 9 bright objects, whatever they were, are long gone over the southern ridges. The mountains stand where they have always stood. And out ahead in the heat of the coming weeks, the saucers are multiplying across the American sky, in 11 states and then 31, over picnic grounds and airfields and back porches, while a nervous, dazzled, exhausted country tilts its face up toward the blue and wonders what it is seeing. That summer is rolling toward its own quiet climax now, in a place we have not yet visited, a ranch in the high desert of New Mexico, where a few weeks from this very afternoon in the first week of July, a rancher will walk out across his pasture after a night of thunder and find the ground scattered with something strange. But that is for the next quiet hour, and there is no hurry to reach it. For now there is only the long golden light over the Cascades and a small plane droning home, and the simple human act of looking up at the sky and not being sure for once what is up there. Let the mountains hold their snow. Let the saucers skip away into the dusk. There is nothing here you need to decide tonight, nothing to settle, nothing to fear. Only the warm summer of 1947, drifting now into memory, and the soft, steady hum of an engine carrying a tired man homeward through the last good light of the day. Picture a high desert pasture in the soft light just after sunrise, somewhere in the dry rolling country of southeastern New Mexico, a long way from anywhere. The land here is open and pale, grassland gone tawny and brittle in the early summer heat, low hills folding away in every direction toward a horizon that is almost perfectly flat. There are no trees to speak of, only the scattered dark shapes of mesquite and the occasional juniper, and the sky overhead is enormous, that wide bleached blue that the desert sky goes in the morning before the day has truly warmed. The air smells of dust and dry grass and the faint resin of brush. A meadowlark is calling somewhere, that long liquid run of notes, and then another answers it far off. There is nothing urgent here. There is only the slow morning and the wide land and the wind that comes and goes across the grass in soft, long passes, bending the seed heads and letting them rise again. Let yourself stand here a moment in the cool of the early hour with nowhere to be and nothing to carry. This is the kind of country that asks very little of you. You can simply breathe and let your shoulders fall and watch the light come up slow across the pasture. This is the Foster Ranch, a sprawl of sheep country some 75 or 80 miles to the northwest of a small town called Roswell, out near a still smaller place called Corona. It is a working sheep ranch, the kind that runs across thousands of acres of this dry grazing land, where a man might ride for an hour and never see a fence. And on this particular morning, the foreman of the ranch is out on his rounds, the way he is most mornings, moving slowly across the pasture with one of the neighbor's children riding along beside him. His name is William Brazel, though almost no one calls him William. They call him Mac. He is a rancher in his late 40s, weathered and practical, a man who has spent his whole life reading the land and the weather and the condition of his animals, a man not much given to flights of fancy. He is simply out checking the sheep, the way he always is, thinking about water and grass and the long hot summer ahead. And then, spread across the pasture in front of him, he sees something that does not belong. It is debris, a great scattering of it strewn out across the grass over a wide stretch of ground, by his own later account, an area perhaps 200 yards across, which is to say a field of wreckage longer than 2 football fields laid end to end. It is not a single object, not a fallen thing you could point to and name. It is bits and pieces, a litter of fragments thrown down across the pasture as if something had come apart high in the air and rained its scraps over the grass. And it is strange material, none of it the kind of thing you expect to find lying in a sheep pasture 80 miles from town. Let the image settle, the wide tawny grass, the early light, and across it this glinting, fluttering scatter of bright, unfamiliar stuff, catching the sun where the metallic pieces lie, stirring softly wherever the morning wind moves through it. We are going to spend this quiet hour with that field of debris, with what Mac Brazel found, and what he said about it, and how the strange scraps in the grass made their slow way from a New Mexico pasture into the hands of the United States Army, and from there into one of the most enduring stories of the age. And we are going to try, gently and without hurry, to keep 2 things separate as we go. What was actually said in those first July days of 1947, set down in the newspapers at the time, and what came later, the embellishments and elaborations that gathered over the decades the way they always do, layer upon layer, until the simple scraps of that summer had grown into something far larger. We will hold both, but we will know which is which. Begin then with the things themselves, described in Brazel's own words as they were taken down by a reporter for the Roswell Daily Record in early July. Because this is the bedrock, the closest thing we have to the debris as it actually was, before anyone had had time to dream over it. There was rubber, first of all, strips of rubber, smoke gray in color, scattered widely across the pasture. There was tinfoil, bright, light, metallic foil, the kind that catches and throws the morning sun. There was what Brazel called a rather tough paper, a heavy paper unlike ordinary wrapping. There were sticks, small light wooden sticks, like the spars of something built to be very light, and there was tape, a good deal of it. Ordinary Scotch tape, and then something stranger. Some tape that had figures printed upon it, small designs that struck people who saw them as flower-like, a pattern of little decorative shapes running along the surface of the tape. That detail, the flowered tape, has traveled a long way over the years and grown stranger in the traveling. But in its first telling, it was simply that tape with a printed floral design, the sort of thing you might find on a child's toy or a holiday decoration. Let those things lie before you in the grass for a moment, plainly the way Brazel first saw them. Rubber, tinfoil, tough paper, light sticks, tape, some of it figured. It is a humble, almost homely inventory, the makings, you might think, of something built cheaply and lightly to ride the wind. And that, in the end, is part of what makes the story so strange, that out of such ordinary-sounding scraps, gathered in a sheep pasture, the legend of visitors from beyond the stars would in time be raised. When the pieces were gathered together, Brazel said they made surprisingly little. The tinfoil and the paper and the tape and the sticks bundled into a package only 18 or 20 inches long and a few inches thick. The rubber made a separate, small bundle. All told, he reckoned the entire scattered field of wreckage, everything thrown across those 200 yards of grass, would have weighed perhaps 5 pounds. 5 pounds. Hold that number gently, because it tells you something about the scale of the thing. Whatever had come apart in the sky over the Foster Ranch had not been heavy. It had been light, almost weightless, a thing of foil and paper and thin wood and rubber, the way a kite is light, the way a balloon is light. And there was one more detail in those first descriptions, a small, careful observation from a practical man. There were eyelets in the tough paper. Brazel noticed small, reinforced holes, as if something had once been fastened or attached there. But there were no strings and no wires. Whatever the eyelets had held, whatever lines or fastenings had once run through them, were gone, or had never been in this scatter of pieces at all. He turned the material over in his hands, this man who knew how things were built and put together, and he tried to make sense of it. He and the boy tried, by his account, to reassemble the pieces, to fit them back together into a recognizable shape, a kite perhaps, something with a form they could name, and they could not. The pieces would not go back together into anything. They did not add up to an object. They were only fragments of an object that was no longer there. That is the field of debris, then, as the man who found it described it. Now drift back with me, gently, through the few weeks between the finding and the telling, because the timing is part of the story too, and it is gentler and more human than the legend tends to remember. Brazel found the debris, by his own account, in the middle of June, around the 14th, he thought. And here is the first quiet, ordinary thing about it. He did not rush it to anyone. He did not gallop into town crying that the sky had fallen. He was a busy man with a ranch to run, and a scatter of light wreckage in far pasture, however odd, was not the most pressing thing on his mind. He left it where it lay, or gathered some of it up, and went on with the long work of the summer. Days passed. Most of 2 weeks passed. The grass kept growing and the sheep kept grazing, and the strange scraps sat out under the wide sky, doing nothing, asking nothing, simply lying in the pasture as the season turned. What changed was not the debris. What changed was the world around it, because in those same late June and early July days of 1947, the country had caught a sudden fever for something new, a thing the newspapers had just begun to call flying saucers or flying discs. It had started a few weeks before, when a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold, flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state, reported seeing a formation of strange objects moving at tremendous speed, skipping, he said, the way a saucer would skip if you sent it across water. The phrase caught fire. Within days, the papers were full of it, and within weeks, people all across the United States were looking up and reporting discs of their own, hundreds of sightings, a wave of them sweeping the country in that strange electric summer. The whole nation, it seemed, had turned its eyes to the sky, half in wonder and half in dread, in a world that was only 2 years out from the end of one war and already uneasy about the shape of the next. It is worth dwelling for a slow moment on just how strange and sudden that wave was, because it is the air the whole Roswell story breathes. In the last days of June and the first days of July, the reports came in from everywhere at once, from California and Oregon and Idaho, from the deep south, from the cities of the east. Ordinary people standing in their yards or driving home from work looked up and saw bright, fast things crossing the sky, and they told the newspapers, and the newspapers told everyone else, and the telling fed the seeing, and the seeing fed the telling, around and around. Some of it was surely birds and balloons and the silver bellies of distant aircraft catching the sun. Some of it no one has ever explained. But the point for our purposes is the mood of it, a whole country, in a single hot fortnight, primed to believe that something unknown was riding the upper air. Whatever scrap of strangeness turned up in those particular days would fall into a world already leaning forward, already half expecting it, and so the timing matters. A scatter of foil and rubber in a sheep pasture might, in a quieter year, have been swept up and forgotten, a small private oddity. Found in the summer of 1947, it could not stay small for long. And it was into that fevered summer that Mac Brazel rode back into the picture. Out at the ranch, far from radios and headlines, he had heard at least something of the flying disc excitement, talk on the radio, talk among the neighbors when he saw them. And it occurred to him, turning the strange scraps over again in his mind, that perhaps what he had found out in the pasture might be one of these things everyone was talking about. Perhaps the wreckage in the grass was a piece of a flying disc. The thought, once it took hold, was enough to send him to town. So picture him going into Roswell, the small, dusty county seat with its few square blocks of low buildings under the same enormous sky, carrying his strange bundle, or at least his strange story, to the one place a practical man takes a problem he cannot solve. He went to the sheriff. The sheriff of Chaves County was a man named George Wilcox, and into his office Brazel came, and there, by one account, he told his story quietly, almost confidentially, leaning in to say that he thought he might have found one of these flying discs that were in all the papers. He had brought some of the material with him. He laid the problem gently on the sheriff's desk. And here the small local matter began, very quietly, to become something larger, because Sheriff Wilcox, faced with a scatter of unidentifiable debris and a rancher who thought it might be a flying disc, in the middle of a summer when the whole country was talking about flying discs, did the sensible thing. He picked up the telephone and he called the airfield. Just outside Roswell sat the Roswell Army Airfield, home to the 509th, the 509th Composite Group, a unit of real and particular weight in that post-war moment. For the 509th was the bombardment group that had carried the atomic bombs to Japan 2 years before. It was at that time the only military unit in the entire world equipped and trained to deliver nuclear weapons. This was no sleepy backwater posting. This was one of the most sensitive air bases in the country, staffed by men accustomed to secrecy and to matters of grave consequence. And it was to this base that the sheriff's call now went, reporting that a local rancher had brought in some strange wreckage that he thought might be a flying disc. The call reached an intelligence officer of the 509th, a man named Jesse Marcel. Major Jesse Marcel was the group's intelligence officer, a serious professional whose job was precisely to assess things like this, to look at what came in and judge what it was and what it meant. He had trained in the reading of aerial photographs and intelligence during the war. He was not a credulous man, but he was a curious and careful one. And when word reached him that the sheriff had a rancher in his office with a story about wreckage from the sky, Marcel took it seriously enough to go and look for himself. He drove into town, he spoke with Brazel, and then to see the thing properly, he arranged to go out to the ranch itself, the long drive northwest across the dry country to the Foster spread, out to the pasture where the debris lay. He did not go alone. With him went another officer, a man named Sheridan Cabot from the counterintelligence side, a careful, watchful presence, the kind of man whose work was to ask quiet questions and notice quiet things. The two of them, with Brazel, made the long trip out to the field of scattered scraps. Let yourself ride that road with them for a moment, in the heat of the early July afternoon, the rough ranch track unspooling across the grassland, the dust rising behind, the wide hills shimmering in the heat, the talk in the vehicle low and occasional. Two military men and a rancher, driving out to look at a scatter of foil and rubber and tape in a far pasture, none of them quite knowing yet what they were driving toward, or how long the small, strange thing waiting in the grass would outlast every one of them. And then they were there, out among it, and Marcel saw the field of debris with his own eyes. By the accounts that survived, the men spent time gathering the material, walking the strewn ground, picking up the pieces, loading what they could into the vehicles. Marcel would describe the material as light and tough and very strange, foil-like metal, so thin it was like the foil from a stick of chewing gum. And yet, he said, you could not dent it or tear it, could not mark it however you tried. There were the light beams or sticks. There was, in his later telling, writing of a sort, small figures, like little decorations, that he could make nothing of. Marcel loaded what he could and drove the debris back toward the base, and at least one account has him stopping at his own home in the small hours of the morning, so taken with the strangeness of the stuff that he woke his family to show them what had come down out of the New Mexico sky. Now here we must slow down and be careful, the way a good guide slows at a place where two paths cross and the signpost has weathered away. Because much of what we have just described, the unbreakable foil, the indecipherable figures, the material that sprang back to its own shape when you crumpled it, the so-called memory foil, comes to us not from 1947, but from much later. Marcel himself did not speak publicly in any detail about Roswell until the late 1970s, more than 30 years after the fact, when an investigator sought him out and he told his story to a new generation. And it is in those later tellings, his and others, that the debris takes on its most marvelous qualities, the metal that could not be cut or burned or dented, the foil that unfolded itself, the strange writing, the sense that here was something not of this earth. These are the details that built the legend. They are vivid and they are unforgettable, and they may even in some part be true. But they are memories recalled across 3 decades, and memory is a soft and shaping thing, and we should hold them more lightly than we hold the scraps described in the newspaper in the very week they were found. For in 1947 itself, in those first contemporary accounts, the descriptions were humbler. Rubber, tinfoil, tough paper, light sticks, tape with a printed design, material that weighed perhaps 5 pounds in all, material that a rancher tried and failed to fold back into the shape of a kite. There is wonder enough in that plain inventory, in the simple fact of strange scraps falling from the sky over a sheep pasture in the summer when the whole country was watching the sky. We do not need to gild it. We can let the first telling stand as the first telling, and the later tellings stand beside it as later tellings, and notice, gently, the distance between them. It is worth pausing, too, over how easily that distance opens. None of these were dishonest people, by and large. Brazel described what he saw plainly enough at the time. Marcel, decades on, described what he remembered. But 30 years is a long time to carry an image, and in those 30 years the image had not sat still in his mind in the dark. It had been talked about and written about and asked about. It had been bent a little by every retelling and every leading question, the way a stone in a stream is shaped by water that never stops moving. By the time he spoke at length, the foil he remembered may well have grown tougher and stranger than the foil he had actually turned over in his hands on that hot July afternoon. This is not deception. It is only what memory does to all of us with anything strange enough and important enough to keep returning to. And it is one of the quiet lessons of this whole long story that the further a marvel travels from the moment it happened, the more marvelous it is apt to become. There is one more thing to carry out of this pasture before we leave it, and it belongs to the man who started it all. Because Mac Brazel, the practical rancher who found the debris and carried his quiet question to the sheriff, did not enjoy what came next. The thing he had set in motion grew very quickly in those first days of July into something enormous and loud, into headlines that would race around the world. And by the time he sat down with the reporter from the Roswell Daily Record, Brazel was already, by every account, weary of it and sorry he had ever spoken. He had become, in a few short days, a harassed man, pestered by the attention, wishing he had left the scraps in the grass and said nothing to anyone. He said in that interview that he was sure what he had found was no weather balloon, for by then an explanation involving a weather balloon had already been offered, and we will come to that and to all the explanations in the hours ahead. But he also said, with the tired plainness of a man who wanted only to be left alone, that if he ever found anything else out in his pasture short of a bomb, he would have a hard time telling anybody about it. There is something very human in that, and we can let it be the note we rest on. A working rancher, out on an ordinary morning, finds a scatter of strange light wreckage across his grass. He puzzles over it, sets it aside, picks it up again weeks later, and carries it to town only because the world has suddenly grown curious about things that fall from the sky. And the moment he speaks, the small private puzzle is taken out of his hands entirely, carried off by sheriffs and soldiers and newspapers, swept up into a story so much larger than the field of debris that the field itself and the quiet man who found it would almost disappear beneath it. He only wanted to know what it was. He never quite found out. Almost no one ever has, to everyone's settled satisfaction in all the years since. So let the pasture go quiet again now, the way it was before any of this began. The men have driven away with their bundles of foil and rubber and tape. The grass closes over the marks of their boots. The wind comes back across the field in its long, soft passes, bending the seed heads and letting them rise, and the meadowlark calls again somewhere out in the wide, tawny country, and the enormous sky burns slowly blue overhead. Whatever fell here has been gathered and carried off, and what it was has gone with it, off down the dusty road toward the base and the headlines and the long argument that will outlast everyone who was there. But the pasture does not know that and does not care. It holds nothing but grass and light and wind now, exactly as it held them on every morning before this one, and will hold them on every morning after. You can rest here in that emptied field with nothing left to puzzle over and nothing left to carry. The strange scraps are gone. The question they raised will keep. It is kept for the better part of a century, and it is in no hurry now. There is only the early light coming up gold across the grass, and the soft return of the wind, and the long liquid call of the bird far off across the hills, and the wide quiet land breathing out the cool of the morning under that enormous, patient, empty sky. Somewhere in a small radio newsroom in the desert town of Roswell, New Mexico, on the afternoon of the 8th of July, 1947, a teletype machine begins to clatter. It is a hot day, the kind of dry high desert heat that settles over everything by mid-afternoon and does not lift, and the office is still, and a man in shirt sleeves is leaning back in his chair when the machine across the room starts up. You can picture the scene easily because it is an ordinary one, the keys striking the paper one after another, the slow scroll of the sheet feeding up out of the carriage, the smell of warm ink and warm dust. And then the words begin to form on the page, line by clattering line, and they are not ordinary words at all. The intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group, the message says, has come into possession of a flying disc recovered from a ranch. Out in the desert near Roswell, the man in shirt sleeves stops leaning back in his chair. He sits forward and he reads it again, and the machine keeps clattering, patient and indifferent, the way machines are. That is where this chapter begins, not with a crash, not with a light in the sky, but with a piece of paper, and the strange, swift life that a piece of paper can take on once it leaves the hand that wrote it. We are going to spend this quiet hour with a single day, the 8th of July, 1947, and we are going to watch a story be born in the morning and die by the evening, all inside the span of a few hot hours. There is nothing in it that needs to trouble you. It is a story about words and about how fast they can travel, and about how just as fast they can be called back, and you can let it carry you along gently, the way a current carries a leaf, without holding to any part of it too tightly. To understand the piece of paper, we have to know the man who wrote it, and the man who told him to. The man who wrote it was a young Army Air Forces officer named Walter Haut, First Lieutenant Walter Haut, the public information officer for the 509th Bomb Group stationed at Roswell Army Airfield. A public information officer is the person whose job it is to speak to the newspapers on behalf of the base, to write the announcements, to answer the reporters' questions, to be the polite official voice of the Army when the Army has something it wishes to say. Haut was a young man that summer, a wartime veteran, well-liked on the base, and on friendly terms with his commanding officer. He was not a man who made decisions of great consequence. He was a man who wrote things down and sent them out, which is precisely what makes his small part in the story so large. The man who told him to write it was the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, a serious and capable officer in command of what was, at that moment, one of the most sensitive military installations in the entire world. The 509th was the only group of its kind on Earth. It was the unit that had dropped the atomic bombs on Japan less than 2 years before, and it remained the sole bomb group equipped and trained to deliver nuclear weapons. Roswell Army Airfield in the summer of 1947 was a place where secrecy was not a habit but a discipline, a place where the most consequential weapons ever built were kept and guarded and flown. And it was the commander of this place, Colonel Blanchard, the man responsible for all that secrecy, who, on the morning of the 8th of July, instructed his young public information officer to announce to the world's press that the Army had recovered a flying disc. You can hold that small strangeness in your mind for a moment, gently, without needing to resolve it. A man whose whole profession was the keeping of secrets, choosing on this one morning to give one away. The words themselves were brief. The press release that Haut typed up and carried out into the heat of that afternoon ran only a short paragraph, and it said, in plain official language, that the many rumors regarding the flying discs had become a reality the day before, when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield had been fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc, through the cooperation of a local rancher and the sheriff's office of Chaves County. He went on to say that the flying object had landed on a ranch in the vicinity of Roswell sometime during the past week, that the rancher, having no telephone, had stored the disc until he was able to contact the sheriff's office, and that the disc had then been picked up and flown to higher headquarters for examination. That was all, a few sentences. It is worth pausing for a moment over the small human chain that the release described, because every link of it was real, and each was an ordinary person who had no idea what they were setting in motion. The rancher was a man named William Brazel, Mac Brazel, as nearly everyone called him, the foreman of a sheep ranch in the lonely country northwest of Roswell, who had come across a scatter of strange wreckage out among his pastures and had puzzled over it for days before bringing a piece of it into town. The sheriff's office named in the release belonged to George Wilcox, the sheriff of Chaves County, the man Brazel went to see when he finally decided the debris was someone else's business. And it was Wilcox in turn who telephoned the airfield, because anything fallen from the sky in that part of the country was the Army's concern, and the Army was right there on the edge of town. So the chain ran from a rancher to a county sheriff to an intelligence officer to a base commander to a young lieutenant with a typewriter, each one passing the strangeness along to the next, none of them imagining that within a day it would be on the front pages of the world. The press release simply gathered that little chain of ordinary people into a few official sentences and handed it to the Wire, and the Wire did the rest. No description of what the thing looked like, no photographs, no claim about where it had come from, only the plain announcement that the Army had won and that it was real. Now picture Hout driving the release around the town that afternoon, because that is more or less how it was done. There were no email inboxes to fill, no websites to update. He carried the paper by hand to the offices of the two local newspapers, the Roswell Daily Record and the Roswell Morning Dispatch, and to the two local radio stations, KGFL and KSWS. He simply handed it to the people whose job it was to put news out into the world, and he drove back to the base, and his part in it was finished. He had written perhaps 150 words and delivered them to 4 small businesses in a desert town of some 25,000 people. And then the words left his hands entirely, and what happened next had nothing to do with him at all. What happened next was the Wire. In 1947, the news of America moved along a vast nervous system of teletype machines, all of them linked together by the great press associations, chiefly the Associated Press and the United Press, which gathered news in one place and flashed it out instantly to thousands of newspapers and radio stations across the country and around the world. A story handed to a small radio station in Roswell did not stay in Roswell. It was read by someone who recognized at once that this was not local news. This was national news, perhaps the most extraordinary news of the year, and it was put onto the Wire, and from that moment it belonged to everyone. One of the Roswell radio men is said to have begun reading the bulletin over the air, and to have been interrupted partway through by a message coming back down the teletype, telling him in effect to stop, but it was already too late. The genie was a few sentences long, and it was already out. Let yourself feel for a moment the speed of that. There was no slow accumulation of interest, no gradual spread of a rumor through a town. The Army of the United States, the same army that had just won the largest war in human history, the institution whose word carried the full weight of the federal government, had officially stated in writing that it had recovered a flying disc. Within an hour or two, that statement was clattering out of teletype machines in newsrooms from coast to coast. By the late afternoon of the 8th of July, the story was moving across the entire country and leaping the oceans besides, appearing in the evening editions, read out on the radio, carried by the wires to London and beyond. The Roswell Daily Record would set the now famous headline in its own pages. The Army airfield had captured a flying saucer on a ranch in the Roswell region. For a few hours that afternoon, the official position of the United States military was that flying discs were real and that they had one in their possession. It is genuinely difficult to overstate how unusual that is. Governments do not, as a rule, confirm the impossible, and on this one afternoon, for this one stretch of a few hours, one had. But the same speed that carried the story out was about to carry a correction back in, and to understand that, we have to leave Roswell now and travel a few hundred miles to the east, to the city of Fort Worth, Texas, and to a different and more senior officer, sitting in a different and larger office on the same hot afternoon. The debris that the 509th had recovered, whatever it was, did not stay in Roswell either. It had been gathered up out in the desert and brought back to the base, and now, on the orders of higher command, it was loaded aboard an aircraft and flown east. The officer who accompanied it was a major named Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer of the 509th, the very office named in the press release. Marcel was an experienced man, and he had been out to the ranch himself and seen the material on the ground, and he would, decades later, become one of the central figures in the whole long story, his recollections quoted and requoted for the rest of his life. But on this afternoon his role was simple. He was the man flying the debris from Roswell to Fort Worth Army Airfield, which was the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, the command that Roswell answered to. And the man waiting for him at Fort Worth was the commanding general of that 8th Air Force, a brigadier general named Roger Ramey. General Ramey was a more senior officer than anyone in Roswell, and he was about to do something that would undo, in a single afternoon, everything the press release had set in motion. When the debris arrived in his headquarters, it was brought into his office and spread out on the floor sheets of a thin metallic foil, slender sticks that looked like balsa wood, lengths of rubber, scraps of paperback tape, and there was reportedly the faint smell of burnt rubber hanging in the air. And Ramey looked at it, and he reached a conclusion, and his conclusion was not a flying disc. His conclusion was a weather balloon. To make that conclusion convincing, Ramey did two things, and both of them were quick and effective. The first was that he summoned an expert. He sent for a weather officer, a warrant officer named Irving Newton, who was on duty at the base forecasting station that afternoon. Newton was a man who had spent years working with weather equipment, and when he was brought into the general's office and shown the material laid out on the floor, he recognized it, or believed he did, almost immediately. What he was looking at, he said, was the wreckage of a weather balloon and its radar reflector, a device called a Rowan target, a radar tracking target, a contraption of foil and balsa sticks built into the shape of a six-pointed box kite, silvery and light, sent up beneath a balloon so that ground radar could follow the winds in the upper air by tracking the reflector as it rose. Newton had seen many of them. They were ordinary. They were the kind of thing that drifted down out of the sky onto ranches all the time, torn and tangled, looking like nothing recognizable until you knew what you were looking at. He told the general it was a balloon and a radar target, and for the rest of his long life, he never wavered from that account. The second thing Ramey did was to let the press in to see it, and this is where the most enduring images of the entire affair were made. A reporter and photographer from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, a man named J. Bond Johnson, was sent over to the base that afternoon, drove the short distance out, and was admitted to Ramey's office, where the debris was arranged on the floor. And there, on the carpet of a general's office in Texas, the photographs were taken that would be reprinted for the next 80 years. General Ramey kneeling beside the torn foil and broken sticks. Major Marcel, the same Marcel who had flown the material in from Roswell, crouched over it, holding up a piece of the foil for the camera. The senior officers of the 8th Air Force posed around a small heap of crumpled material on the floor, presenting it calmly to the world as the homely, harmless wreckage of a weather instrument. Pictures went out on the wire just as the original announcement had, and they carried with them a single unmistakable message, which was that there was nothing here. A balloon had come down. A young officer in Roswell had gotten excited and overstated things. The Army regretted the confusion. Move along. It worked almost instantly and almost completely. The retraction traveled the same wires as the original story, and it reached the same newsrooms, and the editors who had set their evening headlines about a captured flying saucer now set their morning headlines about an embarrassed army in a weather balloon. The story that had blazed across the country in the afternoon was, by the next morning, already deflating. The Roswell Daily Record itself, the day after its flying saucer headline, ran the correction, General Ramey had emptied the saucer, in the wry phrasing of the day. The thing that had seemed for a few hours like the most extraordinary news in the world had been quietly reclassified as a minor and slightly comic mistake, and the public, by and large, accepted the reclassification and lost interest. Within a day or two, the wires had moved on to other things. The flying disc of Roswell, which had lived so brightly for a single afternoon, simply faded out, and for the better part of the next 30 years, almost no one thought about it at all. It became a footnote, a small piece of trivia from a strange summer when half the country seemed to be seeing flying discs, and most of them turned out to be nothing. And there is a real lesson in that speed in both directions, and it is worth resting on quietly before we go any further. Notice how fast the story rose, and notice how fast it fell, and notice that both the rising and the falling were the work of the same machinery, the press wire, the official statement, the photograph, the headline. The thing that made the flying disc reel for an afternoon was not a disc. It was a sentence issued by an authority, carried by a network built to spread sentences quickly. And the thing that made it unreal again by the next morning was another sentence, issued by a higher authority, carried by the same network. The physical material on the desert ranch never changed at all between the morning and the evening. It was the same torn foil and broken sticks at noon that it was at dusk. What changed was the words placed around it, and which man of which rank was speaking them, and how fast those words could travel. The whole event, in its first telling, was made almost entirely of language, and language, it turns out, can be recalled as easily as it can be released. That is the part of this day that has kept investigators arguing for decades, and we will not try to settle it tonight. We will only lay it out gently, the way you turn an object slowly in the light, because the question that hangs over the whole afternoon is a simple one, and it has no simple answer. If the thing was always just a weather balloon, why did the commander of an atomic bomb group, a man whose entire professional life was the careful guarding of secrets, issue a press release announcing a flying disc in the first place? Experienced officers do not, as a rule, mistake a weather balloon for a flying saucer, and they do not, as a rule, broadcast such a mistake to the world's press. And on the other side of the question, if the thing was something extraordinary, why announce it at all, only to call it back hours later? Why not simply say nothing? The believers point to the strangeness of the original announcement and ask why a careful man made it. The skeptics point to the ordinariness of the debris and ask why anyone ever doubted the balloon. And the photographs sit in the middle of it all, showing torn foil on an office floor, neither confirming nor denying, the way photographs of small torn things tend to do. There is one more small thread in those photographs that we should follow before we let the day go, because it has occupied people for a long time, and it is a fine, quiet thing to drift on. In some of the pictures taken in Ramey's office that afternoon, the general is holding a sheet of paper in his hand, a memo, a teletype message, folded over so that its printed text faces partly toward the camera. It is a wholly incidental thing, a piece of paper that happened to be in a man's hand while a photograph was taken, and at the time no one gave it the slightest thought. But the text on that page was caught by the camera, faintly at the edge of legibility, and in the decades since, researchers have enlarged those photographs again and again, scanning the original prints at the highest resolutions the old film will allow, trying to read the few dozen words held in the general's hand on the afternoon the story died. It has come to be called the Ramey Memo, and people have spent years on it, bringing in document examiners, comparing letter shapes, arguing word by word, and even letter by letter over what it might say. Some readers believe they can make out phrases that suggest something far stranger than a balloon. Others read the same faint marks and find only the ordinary language of a routine military message. The original paper is long gone, lost or discarded decades ago, and so there is no way to settle it. There is only the photograph and the grain of the film and the limits of what the eye and the machine can pull out of a blur. It is in its way a perfect small emblem of the whole affair. A piece of paper photographed by accident that may say everything or may say nothing, and that we can no longer quite read. So that is the 8th of July, 1947, a single day, opening in the clatter of a teletype in a quiet desert newsroom, and closing in the calm of a general's office with the debris swept up off the floor. A young lieutenant wrote a few sentences. A colonel told him to. The wire carried them across the world in an afternoon. A general looked at some torn foil and called it a balloon, and a weather officer agreed, and a photographer took the pictures, and the same wire carried the correction back across the world by morning. And then the country, which had believed the impossible for the length of one hot afternoon, simply stopped thinking about it and went on to other things, the way a person wakes from a vivid dream and within minutes can barely recall it. The flying disc of Roswell went asleep that summer, and it slept for 30 years. There is a great gentleness in that ending if you let yourself feel it, the way the whole electric excitement of the morning simply settled by evening into nothing much at all. No one was hurt, no one was lost. A piece of paper said one thing, and then a louder piece of paper said another, and the desert went quiet again under the same hot sky it had always had. Whatever lay on that ranch in the first week of July, the world decided for the time being that it was only a balloon, and the world rolled over and slept on it, untroubled for a very long time. We know now that it would wake again, that decades later people would come back to the same single day and read every word of it 100 times over, and pore over the foil in the photographs, and try to read the paper in the general's hand. But that is for later, far down the long road of this night, and there is no need to reach for it now. For now there is only the 8th of July, settling into its warm desert evening, the teletype gone quiet at last, the office empty, the foil swept up and carried away. There is only the slow cooling of the air after a hot day, and the long shadows reaching out across the dry ground, and a story laid down to rest before it had even fully wakened. Let it rest, let the wires fall silent. Let the headline of the afternoon fade into the correction of the morning, the way the light fades out of a desert sky slowly and then all at once, leaving the stars. There is nothing here you need to carry forward. The paper has been written and recalled, and the day is done, and you can let it go entirely now, down into the quiet, where the rest of the night is waiting. Picture a flat stretch of desert in southern New Mexico, just before sunrise, in the first week of June in the year 1947. The air is cool and dry and very still, the way the high desert air is still in the hour before the heat arrives, and the sky to the east is going from black to the deep blue of early morning, and then to a pale, gray gold along the line of the Sacramento Mountains. There's an airfield here at a place called Alamogordo, and on the open ground beside it, a small group of men is working in the half-light, quietly the way people work when the day has not quite begun. They are inflating balloons, not one or two, but a long line of them, pale rubber spheres, each one filled with gas and tugging gently upward, tethered in a chain that runs along the ground and lifts link by link into the brightening air. There is no hurry in their movements. There is only the soft hiss of the gas, and the creak of the lines, and the low voices of the men checking their instruments, and the enormous quiet of the desert all around. You can rest here for a while in this calm gray morning, because this is where the answer to a famous mystery quietly begins, not with a crash, not with anything frightening, but with a handful of young scientists and a string of weather balloons rising into a New Mexico dawn. Let your breathing slow to match the slowness of that morning. There is nothing here that needs to be solved tonight. There is only a story to follow, gently, from one end to the other, the way you follow a path you are in no hurry to reach the end of. The balloons rise, and as they rise, they straighten into a single tall column. This is what the men call a balloon train, and it is a remarkable thing to picture. Imagine a cluster of balloons at the very top, and beneath them, a long, thin line descending and strung along that line, like beads on a string, all manner of small devices and instruments in odd shapes, swaying a little as the whole assembly lifts free of the earth. The complete train, when it is fully aloft, stretches an extraordinary distance from top to bottom. Some of these flights ran 600 feet from the highest balloon to the lowest piece of equipment. Some ran 700 or 800 feet taller, stood on end than almost any building of that era. A single flight could carry more than 20 balloons, 24 pale rubber spheres rising together, sharing the load so that if one or two failed and burst, the rest would carry on holding the train aloft. It is a strange and beautiful sight to hold in the mind. A slender tower of balloons and instruments, hundreds of feet tall, drifting up off the desert floor at dawn and turning slowly to the east-northeast on the morning wind, toward the mountains and the open country beyond. Now the men launching it knew exactly what it was, but almost no one else in the world did, and that is the heart of the whole story, because this was not an ordinary weather experiment, it only looked like one. The balloons and the instruments and the long swaying train were the visible part of something secret, something that had a code name, and the code name was Project Mogul. Let us drift back a little gently to understand what Project Mogul was trying to do, because once you understand it, a great deal of the famous mystery quietly dissolves, not with a bang, but the way fog lifts off a field as the sun comes up. The year is 1947. The Second World War has been over for less than 2 years. The United States has built and used the atomic bomb, and for the moment, it is the only country in the world that possesses one. But everyone in a position to know understands that this will not last. The Soviet Union is working on its own bomb, somewhere out in the vastness of its territory, and the great anxious question hanging over the American military and its scientists is a simple one. When the Soviets finally test an atomic weapon of their own, how will we know? How does one country on one side of the world detect the secret explosion of a bomb on the far side of it? The answer that a geophysicist named Morris Ewing proposed was a quiet and elegant one, and it had to do with sound. Ewing had spent years studying the deep ocean, and he had discovered something extraordinary about how sound travels through the sea. At a certain depth in the ocean, there exists a layer, a channel, where the temperature and the pressure combine in just the right way to trap sound waves and carry them for enormous distances, thousands of miles, with very little loss. Sound, you see, does not always travel in a straight line. It bends ever so slightly toward the regions where it moves more slowly, and in that particular ocean layer the conditions are such that a sound which begins to wander upward is bent gently back down, and a sound which begins to wander downward is bent gently back up, so that it is held as if cupped between two soft hands and carried onward and onward without ever escaping to the surface or sinking to the floor. A whale's call or the low thud of a far-off disturbance could ride that channel halfway across an ocean and still be faintly heard at the other end. It seemed almost like a secret corridor running through the sea. And Ewing wondered whether the atmosphere high above the earth might have a corridor of its own, a layer in the upper air where the sound of a distant explosion might be caught and carried, the way the ocean carried sound through its hidden depths. The thinking went that somewhere up near the boundary where the lower atmosphere gives way to the stratosphere, perhaps 10 or 15 miles above the ground, there might be just such a sound-bearing layer, a quiet channel in the sky. If it existed, then a microphone placed in it, held patiently aloft at exactly the right height, might be able to hear an atomic bomb go off thousands of miles away, to catch the deep, slow, subaudible rumble of a test in the heart of the Soviet Union, a rumble far below the lowest note a human ear can hear, and to register it as a tremor on a paper chart back on the ground. It was a beautiful idea, and like many beautiful ideas, it was difficult to prove, and the only way to find out whether the channel was really up there, and whether a microphone could really live in it long enough to listen, was to build the equipment and float it up in sea. That was the whole secret idea of Project Mogul, to float microphones up into that high quiet layer of the atmosphere and listen for the low sound of distant thunder that was not thunder at all. The balloons rising over Alamogordo that June morning were carrying the equipment to test whether the idea would work, long trains of balloons lifting sensitive listening devices and the instruments to track them up toward the boundary of the stratosphere where they might drift and listen and report back. And there was a real difficulty hidden inside that simple-sounding plan, a difficulty that shaped the whole strange machinery of the balloon trains. To listen properly in that high corridor of the sky, the microphone had to stay there to hold its altitude hour after hour, neither climbing too high nor sinking too low, so that it remained in the channel where the sound would carry. But a balloon does not naturally hold still in the vertical. As the sun warms its gas, it wants to rise. As the night cools it, it wants to fall. And as some of the lifting gas slowly leaks away, the whole assembly wants to sink. So the men devised a clever balancing act. They strung the train with ballast, small weights, often sand or fine shot, and with a sensitive pressure device that could tell, from the air pressure around it, roughly how high the train was floating. When the train sank below its assigned altitude, the device would release a little ballast, and the train, made lighter, would rise back up to where it belonged. In this way, the long swaying column could be coaxed into holding a steady height in the sky for a remarkably long time, drifting horizontally with the wind but staying, more or less, in its narrow band of listening air. It was an ingenious bit of engineering, and it is part of why these trains were so much stranger, and so much longer and more elaborate than the single small weather balloon that most people pictured when they heard the word balloon at all. The work was carried out in large part by a group of researchers from New York University, working under contract and largely unaware, many of them, of the ultimate secret purpose behind the flights they were launching. They had been told to develop balloons that could carry instruments to a constant high altitude and stay there. The deeper reason, the listening for bombs, was held above their heads, classified, known only to a few. The balloon research at New York University was directed by a geophysicist and meteorologist named Athelstan Spilhaus, a man of wide and restless curiosity who in later years would even create a newspaper comic strip about science in the future. And among the young men out on the desert that summer inflating balloons in the cool of the early morning, tending the lines and tracking the flights, was a graduate student named Charles B. Moore. Remember that name gently as you drift, Charles Moore, because decades later, as an old and respected professor of atmospheric physics, he would become one of the most important voices in explaining what had really happened, having been there with his own hands on the lines when it happened. The whole effort had the feel of frontier work, clever young scientists improvising at the edge of what was possible, launching strange contraptions into an empty desert sky, learning as they went, with no notion that any of it would ever be famous. Now let us look closely, and without any hurry, at what these balloon trains were actually made of, because the materials are the key to everything. They are the thread that ties this calm desert morning to the famous debris that a rancher would find scattered across his pasture a week or so later. The balloons themselves were made of neoprene, a kind of synthetic rubber, pale and rubbery, and when it had been up at altitude and exposed to the sun for a time, growing brittle and dark and breaking into flexible scraps that no longer looked much like a balloon at all. Strung along the train were the instruments, the microphones, the radio transmitters that sent the signals back to the ground, the devices that controlled the train's altitude by releasing ballast. And spaced along the line were the things that mattered most for tracking, the radar reflectors. These were called RAWAN targets, and they were ingenious little objects, designed so that a radar set on the ground could find and follow the train as it drifted across the sky. Picture one of these reflectors. It was built a little like a box kite, or like several diamond shapes joined together at angles. A light frame holding flat surfaces arranged so that radar waves striking it from almost any direction would bounce straight back to the receiver, making the small, high object shine brightly on a radar screen far below. They were known by a signal corps designation, the kind of dry alphabet and number name the Army gives its equipment, and a single balloon train might carry 2 or 3 of them spaced along its length, so that the operators on the ground could keep a firm radar fix on the slender column of balloons, even when it had drifted too far away to see with the eye. The frame was made of balsa wood, that very light, soft, pale wood, the wood of toy gliders and model airplanes, almost weightless in the hand, the kind of stick a person could snap between 2 fingers without effort. The flat reflecting surfaces were made of a metallic foil bonded to paper, a shining silvery material with a parchment-like backing, so that it caught the light and crumpled easily and tore and would gleam and flash as it tumbled. And the whole delicate thing, the balsa sticks, the foil panels, the joints where they met, was held together and reinforced at its edges with tape. A flimsy, beautiful, almost toy-like object when you really see it, feather-light wood and shining foil and tape, sent up to chase a radar beam at the edge of the sky. And here is the detail to hold on to as you fall asleep, the small, strange particular that turns out to matter more than almost anything else in this entire mystery. The tape on those radar reflectors was not plain. It was a reinforcing tape printed with decorations, abstract little shapes, flower-like figures, designs in a pinkish-purple hue. And the reason it was decorated at all is almost charming in its ordinariness. The reflectors were manufactured in part by a toy and novelty company in New York City. When the military needed these radar targets made in quantity, the contract went, of all places, to a manufacturer of toys, and the tape that the toy company used to reinforce them was the kind of cheerful printed tape the toy company would have on hand. One officer who watched the targets being produced thought it was the biggest joke in the world that they had to go to a toy maker to build their secret radar reflectors, and that the reinforcing material on the balsa frames was some kind of pinkish-purple tape covered in little figures. So now hold the whole picture in your mind calmly all at once. A long train of pale rubber balloons, a slender line hundreds of feet long, sticks of light balsa wood, shining foil bonded to paper, and a reinforcing tape decorated with little flower-like figures in pink and purple made by a toy company, sticks, foil, rubber, and flower-printed tape. Remember those 4 things, because in another chapter of this story, those are very nearly the exact words a rancher will use to describe the strange debris he found scattered across a sheep pasture. And the moment you set the 2 descriptions side by side, something that had seemed mysterious for 50 years begins, quietly, to make a great deal of sense. The particular flight that matters most in this story is usually called Flight 4. It went up in early June of 1947. The records and the recollections point to the 4th of June, launched from the field at Alamogordo, lifting into that desert dawn and turning to the east-northeast, drifting out across the open country toward a small town called Corona and the ranch land beyond it. The men tracked it for a while, watching its signal cross the sky. And then, as so often happened with these experimental flights, contact was lost. The batteries failed, or the train drifted beyond the reach of the tracking equipment, somewhere out over the empty rangeland, only a short distance, a matter of miles, from the pastures of a ranch managed by a man named William Brazel, whom everyone called Mac. The flight went off the records as one more incomplete trial, one more train that had risen and listened and drifted and gone silent and come down somewhere out in the desert, the way they sometimes did. And the men moved on to the next launch, the next cool gray morning, the next slender tower of balloons rising into the dawn. They had no idea, none of them, that one of their lost balloon trains was about to become the most famous flying saucer in the history of the world. It is worth resting for a moment on how perfectly, how almost inevitably, this was bound to be misunderstood. Project Mogul was secret, deeply secret. The men who found the debris afterward, the ranch hands and the local officers, and even the intelligence officers from the nearby air base, did not have the clearance to know that Project Mogul existed. It could not have been told. So when strange material turned up scattered across a pasture, material made of rubber and foil and balsa and odd printed tape, material unlike anything in the ordinary experience of a New Mexico rancher or even an Army officer, there was no honest, simple explanation available to anyone on the scene. The one true answer, the answer that would have settled everything in a sentence, was locked away behind a security classification, unavailable even to the very people whose job it was to figure out what they were looking at. And so a vacuum opened where the plain answer should have been. And into a vacuum, as you know, stories rush. This is the quiet shape of so many mysteries when you finally see them whole. Not a strange thing without an explanation, but an ordinary thing whose explanation was, for entirely human reasons, kept out of reach at the one moment it was needed. The secrecy was not sinister. It was simply the secrecy of a frightened post-war world trying to learn how to listen for a bomb it knew was coming. But secrecy of any kind, draped over an ordinary thing, will make that ordinary thing look extraordinary to anyone who stumbles onto it without the key. The truth would take a very long time to come out, most of a human lifetime. The flights faded into the past. Project Mogul itself was eventually wound down and replaced by other, better methods of detecting nuclear tests, and its name and its details slipped quietly into the archives, declassified at last but unnoticed, gathering dust. For decades, the events near Corona belonged entirely to the world of the flying saucer, growing stranger and more elaborate with each retelling. And then, in the 1990s, after a member of Congress asked the government to finally account for what had happened near Roswell, the United States Air Force went back into its own old records and reconstructed the whole forgotten program. They published their findings in a report, the first part of it in 1994, with a fuller version following in 1995, a report with a plain and almost gentle title, The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. And its conclusion was that the debris found on the Foster Ranch in the summer of 1947 had been the wreckage of a Project Mogul balloon train, most likely the lost Flight 4 sticks and foil and rubber and flower-printed tape come quietly down out of the sky. And here is perhaps the loveliest part of the whole accounting, the part that gives it the ring of truth. When the investigators went looking for people who had actually been there, they found Charles Moore, the graduate student from that desert summer, now an old man and a distinguished scientist. And Moore remembered. He remembered the balloon trains and the balsa and the foil, and he remembered the tape. Another of the old project men, an officer named Albert Trakowski, remembered it too, and remembered it vividly, because the figures on that tape had been such an odd and memorable thing, such an absurd small detail of a deadly serious secret project. The toy company tape with its little flowers and figures reinforcing the frames of the radar targets they were floating up to listen for the end of the world. Two men half a century later, independently describing the same pinkish-purple flower-printed tape, the very same detail that the rancher and the officers had described in the debris in 1947. The descriptions matched, the thread held. The morning at Alamogordo and the strange wreckage in the pasture turned out to be the two ends of a single quiet story. So let the picture settle now softly as you drift. None of this requires you to give up your sense of wonder, and in the chapters still ahead, we will be honest about the parts of the Roswell story that the balloon does not so neatly explain, the memories and the claims that came later and that do not fit so cleanly into a train of rubber and balsa. We are not closing any doors tonight. We are only laying one explanation gently on the table, the way you would lay out a single playing card, face up, and look at it without insisting on anything. And it is a good card. It is the one that begins on a calm desert morning, with no monster and no crash and no frightening thing at all. Only a string of pale balloons rising into a New Mexico dawn, carrying foil and balsa, and a length of flower-printed tape up toward the high, quiet layer of the air where a microphone might hear a distant bomb. You can stay in that morning as you fall asleep, if you like. The desert is cool and silent. The mountains are catching the first gold of the sun along their ridges, and the long shadows of the dawn are drawing slowly back across the sand. The balloon train lifts free of the ground, link by link, swaying gently, turning slowly to the east, and the young men below watch it go, shading their eyes against the new light, their work done for the morning. There is coffee somewhere, and the day's heat is still hours away, and the only sound now is the faint creak of the last line paying out and the small, dry wind moving over the open ground. There is nothing fearful here. There never was. There was only a long tower of balloons, rising into the dawn over the high desert, drifting off toward the open country on the morning wind, growing smaller and paler and quieter until it was lost in the brightening sky. And somewhere out there, beyond the mountains, it would come softly down again, into the grass of an ordinary ranch, and wait, patient as all lost things are patient, to be found and misunderstood, and remembered for far longer than anyone who launched it could ever have dreamed. Rest now, the balloons are rising, the desert is quiet, and the rest of the story can keep until you are ready for it. For a long time, nothing happened at all. That is the strange and quiet truth at the center of this chapter, and it is worth letting it settle over you slowly, the way dust settles in a room where no one has walked for years. The thing that the whole world would one day call the Roswell incident sat for nearly 3 decades in almost perfect silence. No headlines, no documentaries, no crowds gathered at a roadside marker in the desert. The summer of 1947 came and went, and the newspaper that had shouted about a captured flying disc printed its correction the very next day, and the people of that small New Mexico town went back to their ordinary lives, and the story simply lay down and slept. Picture it that way if it helps you toward your own sleep tonight, a story laid down in the dry, warm earth of the high desert, the way a seed lies dormant in the ground, holding something inside itself, waiting for a season that has not yet come. The years passed over it the way years do, without drama. The base outside town changed its name and changed its mission. The runways that had once launched the only atomic bombing group in the world fell quieter, and then quieter still. The rancher who had found the strange debris in his sheep pasture went on ranching. The intelligence officer who had gathered it up and flown it to Fort Worth was reassigned, promoted, sent elsewhere, and then in time retired and went home to Louisiana and opened a small television and radio repair shop and grew older among his neighbors, and most of them never knew that there was anything unusual in his past at all. The reporters who had written the first excited dispatches moved on to other stories. The general who had announced the weather balloon stood in front of his scraps of foil and rubber and let the cameras click, and that, for the world at large, was the end of it. And meanwhile, all around this one sleeping story, the wider subject was very much awake. This is one of the genuinely curious things about these years, and it is worth holding in your mind as you drift, because it makes the silence around Roswell all the stranger. The 1950s and 60s were a great age of flying saucers. The phrase itself had been born only weeks before the Roswell episode, when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold described 9 bright objects skipping over the mountains of Washington state, and a newspaperman turned his words into the image that would define a generation. After that, the sightings came in waves. There were reports over the nation's capital in the summer of 1952, lights in the sky above the White House and the Capitol dome, fighter jets scrambled into the dark. There were government studies with quiet names: Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, files thickening in cabinets, investigators driving out to interview farmers and policemen and airline crews. There were magazines and paperback books and matinee films full of saucers and ray guns and visitors from the stars. And toward the end of the 1960s, the government tried at last to close the whole subject down. It commissioned a long study at a university in Colorado, and that study delivered its verdict in 1969, concluding that nothing in 20 years of reports justified any further attention, and so Project Blue Book was shut, the cabinets locked, the matter declared finished. The idea that something might be up there watching was everywhere in those decades, woven right through the ordinary fabric of the age. And yet, for all of that noise, all those reports and studies and films, the one event that mattered most slept on, unmentioned beneath all of it. But Roswell was not part of it, that is the thing. Through all those years of saucer fever, the one event that would later become the most famous of them all was almost never mentioned. It was not in the major books. It was not in the government's long lists of unexplained sightings. When the great catalogers of the strange assembled their lists of unexplained things, the New Mexico debris field of 1947 was simply not there. The story had been told once for a single day and then corrected, and then it had gone back to sleep, and the world had let it sleep. For 30 years it was, very nearly, a thing that had never happened. And then one afternoon, a man was sitting in a television studio in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, waiting. His name was Stanton Friedman, and he is worth knowing a little, because the whole long second life of this story turns on him. Friedman was not a crank shouting on a street corner. He was a nuclear physicist by training, a man who had worked on serious and secret programs, on nuclear aircraft, on space-going reactors, real engineering for real machines meant to carry power off the surface of the Earth. Somewhere along the way he had become fascinated by the question of flying saucers, and he had begun, in his careful, methodical way, to give lectures about them, to travel from town to town presenting the case that some of these reports might be exactly what they seemed to craft from somewhere other than here. He approached the subject the way an engineer approaches a problem, gathering documents, chasing down witnesses, demanding names and dates. And on this particular afternoon in 1978, he had come to that Baton Rouge station to do an interview, and the interview was running late, and he was waiting around as one does, and he fell into conversation with the manager of the station. It is one of those moments that turns on nothing, on small talk, on a delay, on a man with time on his hands. The station manager mentioned in passing that there was a fellow not far away, over in the town of Humor, who had once handled the wreckage of a flying saucer. He gave Friedman the name. The name was Jesse Marcel. You can let that scene hang in the quiet for a moment, the studio with its cables and its lights, the long afternoon, two men talking idly, and a thread being handed across the space between them that no one yet understands the weight of. Friedman took the name down. He followed it. He found Marcel, by then a man in his late 60s, retired, living his quiet life among his radios and televisions, and he sat down with him and began to ask his patient, methodical questions. And Marcel told him a story. He was, in many ways, the ideal witness for a story that wanted to be believed, not a dreamer, not a man given to wild talk, but a career officer, an intelligence man trained to look hard at things and report them plainly, the sort of person whose whole working life had been the careful weighing of what was real. He told Friedman that back in 1947 he had been the intelligence officer at the Roswell base, that he had been sent out to a ranch to gather up strange material scattered across a pasture, that he had brought it in and handled it and looked at it closely. And he told Friedman that the material had been unlike anything he had ever seen, light, strong, foil-thin metal that you could crumple in your hand, and that would smooth itself flat again with no crease, small beams marked with figures he could not read. He said, in words that would be quoted for decades afterward, that it was nothing made on this earth. And he said something more, something that turned a curiosity into an accusation. He said that the photographs taken afterward, the ones showing him kneeling beside the scraps of balloon and foil, had been staged. He said that the real debris had been taken away, and that ordinary weather balloon material had been put in front of the cameras in its place, so that the public would see the harmless thing and never know about the other thing. He said the weather balloon had been a cover story. Here in that small living room in Louisiana, the seed in the desert ground finally found its season. Because now there was not just a strange old event from a forgotten summer. Now there was a named, credentialed witness, an Army intelligence officer, a man who had been there, who had touched the material with his own hands, saying on the record that the official explanation had been a lie. That changes a story entirely. A weather balloon that fell on a ranch is not a story at all. But a weather balloon that was wheeled out to hide something else, that is a story with a shape, with a secret at its heart, with a question that pulls at you. That is a story that can grow. Friedman did what investigators do. He did not stop at Marcel. He went looking for others, for the rancher's family, for neighbors, for old servicemen, for anyone who had been near the high desert in that summer. He gathered names and accounts, and as he gathered them, he came to a conclusion that he would hold for the rest of his life and state without flinching. That the United States government had recovered a crashed craft of unearthly origin, and had hidden the fact for 30 years, in a concealment he would come to call, with deliberate weight, cosmic Watergate. The word Watergate was fresh then, raw, the great recent proof that governments do lie, do cover up, and can be caught. To borrow that word for the saucers was to say, in effect, you have already seen that they keep secrets this large. Why not this one too? The story began to move. In November of 1979, Marcel appeared on film for the first time, in a documentary about flying saucers, telling his account to a camera, his plain, steady voice carrying the claim out past the living room and into the wider air. And then, in 1980, the story found the vehicle that would carry it farthest. That vehicle was a book. It was called, simply and effectively, The Roswell Incident, and it was published in the autumn of 1980. It carried two names on its cover. One was William Moore, a researcher who had thrown himself into the case, chasing down witnesses alongside the material Friedman had developed. The other was a name that you may already half recognize if you have spent any of these long nights with us before, because it belongs to a man we have met in another story on another sea. The other name was Charles Berlitz. Berlitz is one of those quiet hinges that the history of modern mysteries turns on, and it is worth pausing over him, gently, here in the dark. He came from a famous family of language teachers. The Burlett's name was on language schools all over the world, but his own gift was for something else. His gift was for taking a strange, scattered, half-forgotten set of events and gathering them up and shaping them into a single irresistible narrative that millions of people would buy and read and believe. A few years earlier, he had done exactly that with another mystery. He had written a book about a stretch of ocean off the coast of Florida and Bermuda, a book that took a loose handful of lost ships and missing planes and bound them together under one ominous name, and that book had sold something close to 20 million copies around the world and burned the phrase Bermuda Triangle into the mind of an entire planet. The same hands that drew the triangle over the warm Atlantic now reached out toward the New Mexico desert. The man who had made one modern legend was about to help make another. The book told the story with all the confident momentum of the genre. It said that an extraterrestrial craft had been flying over the New Mexico desert, drawn there, perhaps, by the nuclear weapons being tested and stored in that very region. For this was the one corner of the Earth where atomic bombs were built and dropped and kept, and what watcher from the stars, the argument went, would not be drawn to that. It said that the craft had been struck, possibly by lightning, in the violent summer storms of the high desert, and had broken apart and crashed, and that the crew aboard it had died. And it said that the government had moved within hours to gather the wreckage and the bodies and to bury the whole thing under a cover story, a weather balloon wheeled out for the cameras while the truth was flown away to secret laboratories. The book did not invent every piece of this out of nothing. It rested on the witnesses, on Marcel above all, on the accounts that Friedman and Moore had gathered between them. But it took those scattered pieces and it shaped them, the way a storyteller shapes them, into one smooth and terrible and fascinating whole. It gave the desert a saucer, and the saucer a crew, and the crew a grave, and the grave a government standing guard over it. It gave the 30-year silence a reason. The silence, the book said, was not because nothing had happened. The silence was because something so enormous had happened that it had to be hidden. It is worth saying, quietly and fairly, that the book did not change the world overnight. It sold, but it did not explode. It was reviewed in places and dismissed in others as a stack of second-hand and third-hand stories built up into a conclusion the evidence could not carry. For a few years after 1980, the Roswell story was awake, but it was not yet famous. It was a thing that the people who followed such matters knew about, traded letters about, argued over at gatherings in hotel conference rooms. The great fame was still ahead, but the crucial thing had been done. The story had been given its modern shape. The crashed saucer, the dead crew, the recovered bodies, the cover-up, all of it was now in print, set down in a form that other tellers could pick up and carry. The seed had not just sprouted, it had become a plant that could drop its own seeds in turn. And through the 1980s and into the 1990s, that is exactly what it did. The story spread the way stories spread in that age, through every channel that could carry it. The supermarket tabloids took it up, the National Enquirer, which reached an audience of millions standing in checkout lines across the country, ran Marcel's account and put the words of an old intelligence officer in front of more eyes in a single week than any careful book could reach in a year. There is something worth noticing in that quietly as you drift, that the story traveled farthest not through the patient pages where it had been born, but through the bright and hurried channels that asked nothing of the reader but a moment's glance in the checkout line. The book asks you to sit and weigh and consider. A headline above the bananas asks only that you feel a small cold thrill and carry it home. And it was the thrill, more than the weighing, that carried Roswell out across the country. Television found it. In the autumn of 1989, a program devoted to the strange and the unexplained, hosted by a grave and familiar voice, told the Roswell story to a national audience on an ordinary weeknight, with reenactments, with shadowy desert scenes, with the suggestion of a secret held just out of reach. And millions of people who had never heard the name of that small New Mexico town heard it now, in their own living rooms, in the flickering blue light. The same program returned to the story again a few years later, and around it grew everything else. New books, each one adding witnesses and details and certainty, each one building on the last, conventions and lectures. New accounts that went further than the old ones, that spoke now not just of debris but of bodies, not just of one crash site but of several, not just of a cover-up but of a vast and ongoing machinery of concealment. Witnesses who had said little or nothing for decades came forward now, their memories sharpened or perhaps reshaped by all they had since heard, and each new voice was woven into the growing whole. And the town itself, which had let the story sleep for 30 years, slowly woke to what it now possessed. By the early 1990s, Roswell had begun to understand that the strange thing in its past was not an embarrassment but a treasure, that people would drive for hundreds of miles to stand where it might have happened, that the name of the town had become, all over the world, a single word that meant the saucer and the cover-up and the secret in the desert. The story had come home, and the place that had once corrected it now built its small museums and painted its alien faces on its shop windows and welcomed the pilgrims who came looking for the thing that had slept so long in the ground beneath them. You can watch across these years the same thing happening that happens to all such stories, the thing we have watched happen to a triangle of ocean and to lines drawn on a desert floor. Each retelling smooths the story a little. Each one adds a little drama and removes a little doubt. The first account, in that living room in Louisiana, had been a careful old man describing odd metal he had handled once. By the 1990s, the story being told around the world had grown bodies and autopsy tables and refrigerated hangars and decades of government lies, a vast edifice raised on that single small foundation. Some of what was added was honest mistake, the ordinary drift of memory and retelling over time. Some of it would later turn out was simple invention, including a piece of film that surfaced in the middle of the 1990s, claiming to show the dissection of one of the recovered creatures, a grainy reel watched by enormous audiences around the planet, which its own makers would in time confess they had built from scratch, a costume and a set, and a story dressed up as a secret. But honest or invented, all of it flowed in the same direction, all of it piling onto the thing that had lain so long asleep in the desert ground, until the little corrected newspaper story from a single summer day in 1947 had become one of the most famous stories on Earth. And that is the shape of it, the strange double life of this story, which is really what this chapter is about, more than any saucer or any general or any scrap of foil. A thing happened in the desert. For one day the world looked at it, and then for 30 years the world forgot it entirely, while flying saucers blazed across the rest of the culture, and this one event sat in the dark, unmentioned, very nearly erased. And then a physicist with time to kill in a television studio was handed a name, and he pulled the thread, and the thing woke up. And once it was awake, it grew and grew, fed by a book and by the man who had made the Bermuda Triangle, fed by tabloids and television and the endless human appetite for a secret kept just out of reach, until it filled the sky. There is something almost gentle in watching how it happened when you slow it down this much, how little it took in the end. A delayed interview, a bit of small talk, a name passed from one man to another in a quiet room. The whole vast modern legend rests at its root on a single conversation between an old man and a careful visitor, and on the simple, irresistible power of a story that gives the silence a reason. People wanted there to be a reason. They wanted the 30 years of quiet to mean that something had been hidden rather than that nothing had been there, because a hidden thing is so much more interesting, so much more bearable in its way than an empty desert and a fallen balloon. And so when the reason was offered, they took it and they carried it and they made it enormous. We are not going to decide tonight whether they were right to. That is not the work of this hour. The work of this hour is only to watch the story come back to life slowly across the long years, to see it laid down in the warm ground in 1947, and to see it rise again in 1978, and to understand that the famous mystery we know today was not born whole on a ranch in New Mexico. It was assembled gently and gradually over decades by particular people in particular rooms, each one adding a little to what the last had left behind. That does not make it false. It does not make it true. It only makes it human, which is the most that can be said of nearly everything we tell each other in the dark. So let the years pass over the desert again, slowly, the way they passed the first time. Let the base grow quiet and the rancher grow old and the foil scraps gather dust in some forgotten box. Let 30 years go by in the space of a breath, the way they go by when you are not the one living through them. And then let the thread be picked up again, far away, in a small bright studio on a long afternoon, and let the old man tell his story one more time into the gathering quiet. There is nothing here you need to carry. The story has done its own carrying across all these years without any help from you. It found its way back from the dark on its own, and it can rest there now while you rest too. Let it lie back down in the warm ground. Let the desert keep it. There will be time in the next quiet hour to ask what it might truly mean, but not now, not yet. For now there is only the long passing of the years, and the soft return of an old story to the light, and the slow, even breathing of the dark around you, asking nothing, holding everything, the way the desert holds its secrets and its silences, and the long, warm nights that pass above it, one after another, without end. Imagine a small kitchen in a desert town, late on a warm evening, many years after the summer when the rancher found his field of debris. The window is open a few inches and the dry night air moves through it, and somewhere down the street a screen door taps in the wind, and the light over the table is the soft yellow of an old bulb. An old man sits there with his hands folded, and a younger one sits across from him with a tape recorder turning slowly between them, the little reels going round and round, gathering up a voice. The old man is remembering something that happened decades ago, when he was young. On a July day he has thought about more times than he can count. And here's the gentle, ordinary truth at the center of this chapter, the one we will turn over slowly tonight, without alarm and without any hurry at all. A memory is not a photograph. It is not a thing pulled whole and unchanged from a shelf in the back of the mind. It is something built again, each time out of the pieces that remain, and the pieces that remain are not always the ones that were laid down at the start. That is not a flaw in this old man, or in any of the men and women we will meet in this hour. It is simply how memory works in all of us all the time. You do it yourself every day without ever noticing. When you call up a scene from your own past, a childhood room, a face, an afternoon, you are not opening a sealed box, you are reassembling. You take the few firm pieces you still hold, and around them your mind quietly fills in the rest, drawing on what you have learned since, what you have been told, what you have come to expect a scene like that to contain. The reassembled memory feels exactly as solid and as true as the original, indistinguishable from the inside, and that is the strange and important part. There is no inner sense that warns you which pieces are bedrock and which were added later. They all carry the same warm weight of having happened. This is the quiet engine underneath everything we will look at tonight, and it asks nothing of you but to be understood gently as a feature of being human. Researchers have a name for the way this happens. They call it reconstructive memory, the understanding, built up over a century of careful study, that recollection is an act of rebuilding rather than retrieval. The idea reaches back to the 1930s, when an English psychologist named Frederick Bartlett asked people to read a strange, unfamiliar folk tale, and then to retell it over and over across days and weeks and months, and he watched what happened to the story in their hands. The odd parts smoothed out, the unfamiliar details quietly shifted into shapes that made more sense to the teller. Each retelling drifted a little further from the original, not through carelessness, but because the mind was doing what minds do, fitting the remembered thing into the patterns it already carried, making it more sensible, more whole, more like a story that ought to be true. Bartlett called those patterns schemas, and he came to see that we remember not the raw event but our reconstruction of it, shaped by everything we already expect the world to hold. And researchers have studied, in particular, what happens when new information arrives after an event, after the fact, once the original moment is already gone. They call that the misinformation effect, and it has been examined in laboratories since the 1970s. The psychologist Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues showed, again and again in careful experiments, that what people are told about an event afterward can quietly blend into their memory of the event itself, until the borrowed detail and the original detail sit side by side, equally vivid, equally trusted, and no longer separable. In one well-known study, people watched a film of a car accident and were later asked how fast the cars were going, but the question was worded differently for different viewers. Some were asked how fast the cars were going when they hit each other, others when they smashed into each other. The ones who heard the word smashed remembered higher speeds. And more than that, when they returned a week later, those same people were far more likely to recall seeing broken glass at the scene, though there had been no broken glass in the film at all. A single word slipped into a single question had grown over a week into the clear memory of something that was never there. A suggestion offered after the fact can blossom in just this way into a confident recollection of an event that did not occur. People do not lie when this happens. They report in perfect good faith what they now sincerely remember. The memory has simply been rebuilt with new material, and the seams do not show, not even to the one who carries it. Hold that softly in mind, because it is the kindest and most useful tool we have for walking through this part of the Roswell story. Not suspicion, not the assumption that anyone is deceiving anyone. Just the patient awareness that memory is a living thing, and that 30 years is a very long time, and that a great deal can settle into a recollection across 30 years of telling and retelling, of newspapers and television specials and questions asked in particular ways by people who already had a particular story in mind. Think back, drifting over how this story actually traveled through time. For roughly 3 decades after the summer of 1947, Roswell was quiet. The debris in the field, the press release, the swift correction calling it a weather balloon, all of it had faded from public memory almost entirely. A small, forgotten ripple in the great strange summer of the flying discs. There was no legend yet. There were no alien bodies in the telling. There was a rancher who had found some odd material on his land, and a brief flurry of newspaper interest, and then years of silence settling over it all like dust on a high shelf. And then in 1978, a researcher named Stanton Friedman tracked down and interviewed a man named Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who had gone out to the ranch and handled the debris all those years before. And the story came back to life, and from that point on, it began to grow. Notice what was and was not in the story at first. When the tale returned in the late 1970s, it was about the debris, the strange foil that sprang back into shape, the lightweight beams, the material that did not behave the way ordinary material should. It was a story about wreckage. Jesse Marcel, remembering across 31 years, spoke of material he could not account for. He did not, in those first interviews, speak of bodies. The bodies were not yet part of it. The small gray figures, the recovered creatures, the autopsies, those entered the public account later, beginning in 1980 with a book by Charles Berlitz and William Moore that gathered the threads together and reached for something larger, drawing in new accounts of a second sight and of beings found among the wreckage. From there, the story widened. A few years on, another book carried it further still, in a steady procession of witnesses, some recalling events from 60 and 70 years before, added rooms and corridors to a house that had begun as a single open field. And then through the 1980s and into the 1990s, as the story spread across television and paperback and the growing world of people who studied these things, more and more witnesses came forward and the accounts grew richer and the details multiplied, and what had been a quiet tale of odd debris in a sheep pasture became, by slow accumulation, an account of crashed craft and recovered bodies in a sweeping government cover. The story did not arrive whole. It assembled itself piece by piece across years in public exactly the way a reconstructed memory assembles itself, a few firm fragments at the center, and around them, gathering steadily, the material that the surrounding world supplied. None of that by itself tells you what did or did not land in that desert. A story can grow in the telling and still have something true at its heart, but it is worth seeing clearly how the growing happened, because it is the same shape we will find when we look closely at the individual accounts, the particular witnesses whose particular memories became, for a time, the strongest seeming evidence that something extraordinary had been recovered and hidden away. Let us sit then with one of them gently and with real sympathy, because he was by every account a decent man. His name was Glenn Dennis. In the summer of 1947, he was 22 years old, working as a young mortician at a funeral home in Roswell, and his funeral home also ran the ambulance service that the town and the base sometimes called upon. Decades later, beginning in the late 1980s, Dennis told a story that became one of the most quoted in all of Roswell lore. He said that around the time of the crash, he had received strange telephone calls from the air base, asking him about the availability of small, child-sized coffins, and about how one might preserve bodies that had been exposed to the open weather for several days. He said that when he went out to the base hospital on an unrelated errand, he glimpsed unusual activity and was hurried away. And at the heart of his account was a young Army nurse, a woman he knew, he said, who told him, distraught, that she had assisted at the examination of small, strange-looking bodies, and who sketched the figures for him on a scrap of paper, and who was then transferred suddenly far away to England, and who he later heard died not long after in a plane crash. He had been sworn to silence, he said, warned never to speak of it. It is a haunting story told by a sincere man, and for years it stood as one of the most compelling human threads in the whole affair. The detail of the small coffins, in particular, had a terrible specific gravity to it. It was the kind of thing that felt too odd to invent, and so it persuaded. But researchers who went looking for the nurse could not find her. Dennis had given investigators a name, and the name led nowhere. There was no record of such a nurse at the base hospital, no service file, no transfer to England, no plane crash that matched any of it. When the records of the nurses who actually served at the base in that period were examined, none corresponded to the woman he described. Later, the name Dennis had supplied was itself called into question, and the figure at the very center of his account simply could not be located in any of the documents that should have held her, if she had existed as he remembered her. The story had a hollow place precisely where its heart should have been. Among the very researchers who had once championed the Roswell case, careful people who genuinely wanted the story to hold together, confidence in Glenn Dennis's account eroded over time. Some came to conclude that the central figure of his story, the nurse who had seen the bodies, could not be confirmed to have existed at all. This did not necessarily mean that Dennis had set out to deceive anyone. It might mean that across 40 years of remembering and retelling, in a town where the story had become a kind of shared inheritance, pieces had shifted and merged and rebuilt themselves into something that felt, to him, entirely solid, a reconstructed memory, vivid and sincere, whose foundations had quietly given way beneath it. We cannot know with certainty what happened inside one man's mind, and it would be unkind to pretend we can. But we can hold his story the way you would hold anyone's honest, faltering memory of long ago, with tenderness and without building a mountain upon it. There is another witness whose account ran a different course, and his teaches a sharper lesson, though we can tell it just as calmly. His name was Frank Kaufman. Beginning in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Kaufman told an unusually detailed and dramatic story that he had been part of a small, secret team that recovered a crashed craft and the bodies of its occupants, that he had been present at the very heart of the most closely guarded events. He described himself as having held a position of real consequence, with access to the most sensitive operations. His account was specific, confident, and for a while it was taken seriously by some researchers and woven into the larger narrative. Then Frank Kaufman died in 2001, and afterward those who examined his papers found something troubling. Among his belongings were documents that appeared to have been altered, a military record changed to show a higher rank in different duties than the ones he had actually held. His genuine service record told a plainer story than the one he had given, with a more modest rank, that of a staff sergeant and ordinary assignments, nothing like the central secret role he had described. There was, by some accounts, even a supply of old paper among his things, the kind one might use to make a fresh document look aged. The researchers who had once listened to him, including ones who had defended him, concluded that they could no longer trust what he had told them. One who had given his accounts real weight stated plainly afterward that he no longer had any confidence in Frank Kaufman's stories at all. Here, then, was not the soft drift of an honest memory rebuilt across decades, but something firmer and sadder, an account that did not survive the daylight, propped up, it seemed, by paper that would not hold. And it is worth noticing how it came undone, not through belief or disbelief, not through anyone's certainty about flying craft, but through the ordinary, patient work of checking a man's claims against the records and finding that they did not match. That patient checking is the quiet hero of this whole hour, and it ran through two other strands of the Roswell story as well, strands that did not depend on any single person's memory at all, but on documents and on film, on things that seemed at first like hard evidence you could hold in your hands. Picture first a roll of film arriving by mail. In the mid-1990s, a London-based music and video producer named Ray Santilli presented to the world a piece of black and white footage that he said showed the autopsy of an alien recovered from the Roswell crash. Grainy, flickering, shot as if by an unsteady hand in a sterile room, it showed figures in protective suits cutting into a small, pale body on a table. It was extraordinary footage, and it traveled the world, broadcast in more than 30 countries, watched by enormous audiences, argued over endlessly. Santilli said the film had come from a former military cameraman who wished to stay anonymous. For years, the footage hovered in that uneasy space between sensation and suspicion, neither confirmed nor quite dismissed. And then in 2006, Santilli acknowledged the truth. The film was not what it had been presented to be. He and a fellow producer had created it, a reconstruction, they said, of footage Santilli claimed to have seen years earlier, and which had supposedly degraded beyond use, though no such original was ever produced. The famous autopsy had been staged on a modest set built in a London room. The alien body was a model, a hollow cast filled with animal organs and other unglamorous material to give it weight and substance under the knife. The whole haunting spectacle that had captivated audiences across the world had been made by hand, on a small budget, in an ordinary flat. It is, when you sit with it in the quiet, almost a tender thing, how badly people wanted to be looking at something real, and how a simple constructed scene, lit and shot in just the right grainy way, could carry that wanting around the entire planet for more than a decade. And then there are the documents, the most elaborate strand of all, and the one that brushes closest to the machinery of government itself. In 1984, a roll of undeveloped film arrived, again by mail, this time in the hands of an American researcher and filmmaker. Developed, it revealed photographs of typed papers that appeared to be briefing documents of the most astonishing kind. They described a secret committee, supposedly established by presidential order in the late 1940s, made up of leading scientists and military officers and officials, charged with recovering and studying crashed alien craft and the bodies of their crews. The committee, the paper said, was called Majestic 12, often written as MJ-12. If the documents were genuine, they were nothing less than proof of the whole story in the government's own typewriting. But the documents did not hold up to careful examination either. When investigators studied them closely, the small details began to fail. The papers used dating conventions and formatting that did not match the genuine government documents of the era they claimed to come from. The military and official titles were rendered in ways that an actual office of the time would not have used. And most tellingly, a researcher named Philip Klass studied the signature of President Harry Truman that appeared on one of the documents and found that it was not merely similar to a known genuine Truman signature. It was identical to it, exactly down to the smallest stray marks, traced from a real Truman memo of October 1947. That is the kind of perfect match that does not occur when a person signs their name twice, but does occur when one signature has been copied and transplanted onto another page. In time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation looked into the matter, and its conclusion was blunt and unadorned. The documents, it determined, were completely bogus. To this day, the identity of whoever forged them has never been established. But that they were forged is the settled judgment of nearly everyone who has examined them with care. Someone somewhere sat down and manufactured the appearance of official secrecy, and for years their handiwork circulated as the crown jewel of the case. Let these strands lie side by side now, softly, the way you might lay out a few objects on a table before turning down the lamp. A kind old mortician whose vivid memory could not be confirmed against the records. A man whose dramatic account collapsed when his own papers were examined after his death. A piece of film that captivated the world and was at last admitted to be a model on a set. A sheaf of documents that promised everything and proved on inspection to be forgeries no agency could authenticate. Each one in its time seemed like a strong beam holding up the larger structure. Each one, looked at patiently and without heat, turned out to be something else, sometimes an honest memory that had drifted, sometimes a fabrication, sometimes a clever-made thing that people very much wanted to believe. And here is the gentle point of it all, the thing to carry down towards sleep. None of this proves that nothing unusual ever happened in that high desert. It does not close the original question of what fell in the field, which is a separate matter with its own evidence that we have weighed elsewhere in this long night. What these later strands show is something narrower and quieter, and in its way more human. That the most dramatic pieces of the Roswell story, the bodies, the autopsies, the secret committees, the recovered craft, entered the account late, grew in the retelling, and have not survived careful examination. The story we inherit today is not the story that existed in 1947. It is a thing built up over decades, layer upon layer, out of genuine fragments and honest mistaken memories and a few deliberate inventions. All of it bound together by the deep and very ordinary human wish for the world to be stranger and larger than the daylight usually allows. There is nothing to fear in any of this. There is, if anything, something almost comforting in it, in the way that patient, unglamorous work, the checking of records and the studying of signatures and the simple search for a nurse who turned out not to be there, can quietly sort the firm from the soft, given enough time. Rumor compounds, memory rebuilds. Stories gather material as they roll forward through the years, the way a stone rolling down a long hill gathers moss and dust and small bright things that were never part of the stone at all. And then slowly, carefully, people come along afterward and brush some of it away again and look at what is actually there underneath and tell the truth about it as best they can. Both of those motions are deeply human, the gathering and the brushing away, the wanting to believe and the wanting to know. They have run alongside each other through this whole story, and through every story like it, and they are running still, and there is room in the world for both. So let the reels turn down now in that small yellow kitchen, and let the old man's voice fade gently into the warm desert dark. He's not a villain and he's not a fool. He's only a person remembering, the way we all remember, building the past again out of the pieces he had left, doing his honest best with a mind that was never meant to be a photograph. The screen door taps once more in the wind and is still. The tape recorder clicks off, the little reels slowing and stopping. And the night settles over the desert town the way it always has, vast and quiet and indifferent to all our wondering, holding its small true facts and its large grown legends side by side, in the same soft dark, asking nothing of you now but that you rest. Sleep well, there is nothing here to carry with you. The questions will keep, patient as the desert, until you are ready for them again. Picture the high desert at night, somewhere outside the town, where the last streetlight has fallen away behind you and the dark has grown complete. The ground is still warm under your palms from the long day's sun, giving its heat back slowly to the cooling air. You have lain down on your back on the bare earth, the way a person does when there is nowhere else they need to be, and you have let your eyes adjust, and now the sky has opened above you the way it only opens in places like this, far from the cities, far from the glow, where the air is dry and thin and clear, and the stars come down so low and so thick that they seem less like points of light and more like a kind of weather, a silver dust settling over everything. The band of the Milky Way arches across the whole sky from one horizon to the other, pale and grainy and faintly luminous, and you understand, lying there, why people have always done this, why we look up. There is nothing tonight you need to hold on to. Let your breathing slow and let the desert hold you, and let yourself drift while we think, gently and without hurry, about the oldest habit our species has. Because that is what it is, a habit, and an ancient one. Long before there were towns in this desert, before there were the airfields and the army bases and the press releases we have spent these hours with, before there was anyone here at all to call this place New Mexico, there were people lying on warm ground exactly like this, looking up at exactly this sky. The stars have moved only a little in all that time, so little that the constellations our distant ancestors named are very nearly the ones we name now. The hunter, the bear, the seven sisters clustered close. We inherited the sky almost unchanged, and we inherited, along with it, the thing the sky has always done to the human mind, which is to make it wonder. This is worth sitting with for a while, here in the calm middle of the night, because it is the deepest current running underneath the whole Roswell story, underneath all the stories of saucers and discs and lights in the dark that filled the summer of 1947 and the decades that followed. The current is older than any of those stories. It is the simple, enormous fact that the sky is vast and we are small, and that we have never once in all our history been able to look up at it without asking what is out there. The saucer craze did not invent that question. It only gave it a new shape, a shape suited to its particular moment. The question itself is as old as the first upturned face. Think about what the sky meant to the people who watched it before us. It was the first calendar. The slow wheel of the constellations told them when the rains would come, when to plant, when to expect the cold. It was the first map. Sailors found their way across trackless water by the fixed northern star and the patterns around it, trusting their lives to lights they could not reach. It was the first clock, the first compass, the first great mystery that the human mind tried to organize into sense. And it was always and everywhere the place where people put their gods. Look at any old culture, anywhere on Earth, and you will find that the most important things were placed in the sky. The sun was a god or carried by one. The moon governed the months and the tides and the bodies of women. The wandering planets were named for the greatest powers people could imagine. When something mattered beyond all ordinary measure, it went up into the one place that was visibly larger than the whole of the world. The one place that was clearly beyond reach and beyond death and beyond the small troubles of any single human life. So the sky was never only a sky. It was the screen onto which we projected the largest of our questions. The questions about whether we are alone, whether something watches over us, whether there is meaning in the order of things or only the cold turning of distant fires. And when you understand that, you begin to understand why a story like Roswell could take root the way it did and grow the way it grew. It landed in soil that had been prepared for it across the entire span of human time. The ground was ready. It had always been ready. And notice, lying here, how little has truly changed in the looking, even as everything around the looking has changed. The herdsman 3,000 years ago, watching the same stars wheel over the same kind of dry country, asking the same wordless question. He and you are doing the identical thing tonight, separated only by the costume of the age. We call the lights gods, or the campfires of the dead, or holes in a great dark cloth with a brighter world behind it. We call them suns and galaxies and gas and gravity, and our names are truer than his, but the gesture is the same gesture. The tilt of the head is the same tilt. The small ache that opens in the chest when the sky is very clear and very deep, that is the same ache, unchanged across all those generations, passed down through us like the color of an eye. We did not learn to wonder at the sky. We were born already wondering, in every child who has ever pointed upward and asked what is that, and why, and how far. But the particular summer that the story landed in was not just any summer, and that is worth thinking about too, slowly, as the desert cools around you. The summer of 1947 was a very specific moment, and the place this all happened was a very specific place, and the two together made a kind of tinder that the smallest spark could light. Consider where you are lying. This desert, this stretch of New Mexico, was at that moment one of the most secret landscapes on the entire planet. Just a couple of years before, not far from here, in the pre-dawn dark of July 1945, the first atomic bomb in the history of the world had been detonated at a test site called Trinity. A flash brighter than the sun rising in the wrong part of the sky, a heat that turned the desert sand to glass. The people in the surrounding towns saw the light and felt the ground move and were told, by way of explanation, that an ammunition dump had exploded. They were not told the truth, because the truth was the most closely guarded secret of the war. And the men who flew the aircraft that carried those weapons, the only unit anywhere in the world with the training and the planes to deliver an atomic bomb, were stationed right here, at the field outside Roswell. 509th. The same group whose airmen had flown the missions over Japan 2 summers earlier. Their very purpose was a kind of secret. They lived in a world where the most extraordinary things were real and were hidden, where a person could be told that the impossible had not happened when it plainly had, where the official explanation and the actual event were known routinely to be two different things. Sit with what that does to a place. The people of this region had learned by direct and recent experience that their own government held secrets of almost unimaginable scale, and that those secrets were kept right here in their desert under cover of ordinary sounding stories. They had been told an ammunition dump exploded when in fact the age of the atom had begun a few miles from their homes. So when 2 years later something strange was found on a ranch, and the army first announced a flying disc and then very quickly said no, it was only a weather balloon, never mind, the announcement landed on people who already knew in their bones that the simple official story was sometimes a curtain drawn across something far stranger. They were not being foolish, they were being faithful to their own experience. They had been taught by the atomic bomb itself that the truth out here was often bigger than what you were allowed to be told. And over all of it hung the new and particular dread of the age that was just beginning. The war was over, but it had not brought the rest everyone had hoped for. In its place had come something colder and more permanent, the long standoff with the Soviet Union, the knowledge that the terrible weapon America had built could and soon would be built by others, the sense that the sky itself had become a frontier of fear. People scanned the heavens now not only with the old wonder, but with a new and specific anxiety, watching for what might come over the pole, for the bombers, or soon enough the missiles. The sky had always held the gods. Now it also held the possibility of annihilation, arriving from above with no warning. Is it any wonder that a frightened and exhausted people, peering up into that loaded sky, sometimes saw discs there? The discs were, among many other things, a way of giving shape to a formless dread, turning the vague terror of the atomic age into something with edges, something that could be pointed at, something almost manageable because it could at least be named. There is a kind of tenderness owed to all of that, and you can feel it from here, lying safe on the warm ground with the war and its fears long faded into history. The people who looked up in 1947 and wondered, who read the disc stories and felt a thrill of fear or hope, were not gullible fools to be laughed at. They were human beings doing the most human thing there is, in a moment that gave them every reason to do it. They were standing under a vast and frightening sky in a secret-keeping desert at the dawn of an age that had just shown them the world could end, and they were asking the oldest question. What is out there? Are we alone? Is someone watching? The question was ancient. Only the costume it wore was new. It is worth knowing that the country's own government took the question seriously enough in those years to spend the better part of 2 decades trying to answer it. Beginning in 1952 and running until the end of 1969, the United States Air Force ran a long, patient inquiry into the lights people kept reporting in the sky, a program eventually called Project Blue Book, headquartered at an air base in Ohio. Over those 17 years, its investigators gathered and examined more than 12,000 reports of unidentified flying objects, sent in by pilots and farmers and policemen and ordinary citizens who had seen something they could not name. In case by careful case, the great majority of those sightings came apart in their hands into perfectly ordinary things. The planet Venus low and bright on the horizon, whether balloons, flights of birds, aircraft seen at strange angles, the moon glimpsed through moving cloud, the ordinary furniture of the sky misread by a startled eye. A small remainder, a few hundred cases, stayed stubbornly unexplained, not because they were clearly anything extraordinary, but simply because there was not enough information left to settle them one way or the other. And in the end, the Air Force closed the project with a quiet conclusion that nothing it had examined was a threat to the country, and nothing showed any sign of being a craft from beyond the Earth. The investigation had been real and thorough, and the answer it returned was sober. The lights, very nearly all of them, were us and the world, and the sky doing what the sky does. Now here is the gentle turn worth following, as the stars wheel slowly overhead and your thoughts grow loose. Underneath the saucer craze, running parallel to it through all those same years, there was another and quieter way of asking the very same question, a way that was patient and rigorous and full of its own kind of wonder, and that has never needed a single crashed disk to sustain it. While the popular imagination was filling with flying saucers, a small number of serious people were beginning, for the first time in human history, to ask whether we are alone in a way that could actually be tested, not by waiting for something to land, by listening. In the spring of 1960, at a radio observatory tucked into the hills of West Virginia, a young astronomer named Frank Drake pointed an 85-foot dish at two nearby stars that resembled our own sun, and he listened. For a few hours a day across several months, he swept slowly through the radio frequencies, searching for any signal that carried the mark of intention, any pattern that nature alone would not produce, any whisper that might mean someone somewhere out there was trying. He called it Project Ozma, after the princess of a faraway imaginary land, and it was the first time anyone had ever turned the instruments of science toward that ancient question and treated it as something you could investigate rather than merely dream about. He heard nothing that summer, only the hiss and crackle of an indifferent cosmos, but something had begun. The listening had begun. And a few years later, that same Frank Drake did something else that is worth turning over slowly in the dark, because it is the patient way of asking the question in its purest and most beautiful form. He sat down and tried to break the great unanswerable question into smaller, honest pieces, to write it out, not as a yes or a no, but as a chain of things one might actually try to learn. How many stars are born in a year? How many of them have worlds? How many of those worlds might be gentle enough for life? How often life, given a gentle world, might arise at all? How often it might grow toward thought and toward the will to send a signal out into the dark? He did not pretend to know the numbers. That was never the point. The point was to take a question that had only ever been a sigh under the night sky and turn it into something you could approach one careful step at a time, honestly admitting at each step how little was yet known. It was, in its way, the opposite of the saucer story. The saucer story gives you the whole answer at once, complete and thrilling and unearned. Drake's chain of questions gives you only the shape of your own ignorance, laid out plainly with the patient promise that some of the blanks might one day be filled in. It is a slower kind of wonder. It is, perhaps, a deeper one. And the listening went on. It became, over the decades, an entire patient discipline. The search for signs of intelligence elsewhere in the universe, carried out with great dishes turned toward the stars, sifting the radio noise of the heavens for one clear note that does not belong. It is a strange and beautiful kind of work when you think about it from here, under this sky. These are people who have taken the oldest longing of the species, the lying on warm ground, looking up, are we alone longing, and have built it the most careful and disciplined house they could. They do not claim to know the answer. They have not found one. After all these years of listening, the cosmos has not yet spoken, and an honest scientist will tell you plainly that it may never, or that we may simply be listening at the wrong moment with the wrong instruments, or that the silence itself may be the answer. But they keep the question open in the most honorable way there is, by looking genuinely, and by refusing to pretend they have found what they have not. That is the dignified counterpart to the saucer craze, and the difference between them is worth holding gently, because it is, in the end, the difference this whole long episode has been circling. Both come from the same root. Both are children of that upturned face on the warm ground, but one of them leaps to the answer and one of them sits patiently with the question. One says, I saw a light, therefore they are here, therefore the government is hiding it. Other says, the universe is unimaginably large and we do not yet know, and so we will look carefully and we will tell you honestly what we find, even when what we find is nothing. The first is the way of wonder collapsing too quickly into certainty. The second is the way of wonder staying open, staying humble, staying true. The distance between them is the whole distance between credulity and curiosity, and they can feel from the inside almost the same. Both quicken the pulse, both light up the eyes. The only difference is what they are willing to do with the not knowing, whether they rush to fill it, or whether they can bear to leave it open and keep looking. And the thing the patient way knows, the thing it sits with every night, the way you are sitting with this sky right now, is how genuinely vast the real cosmos is. Let the size of it settle over you slowly, because the real scale is more staggering than any saucer story ever dreamed. Those stars above you, the ones you can see, number perhaps a couple of thousand on the very best and darkest night like this one. That is roughly all the human eye has ever taken in, across all of history, a couple of thousand points of light. And every one of them is a sun, many of them larger than ours, and they are only the nearest handful of the stars in our own galaxy, which holds not thousands of them, not millions, but something on the order of 100 billion. 100 billion suns in our single galaxy alone, the great pale river of them spilling across the sky above you tonight. And our galaxy is one galaxy among, by current reckoning, hundreds of billions of galaxies, perhaps even more, each one its own vast wheel of 100 billion suns, scattered out through a darkness so deep and so wide that the light arriving in your eye from the farthest of them set out long before the earth itself was formed. You cannot truly hold that in your mind. No one can. The mind was not built for it. It was built for the warm ground and the few thousand visible stars in the small circle of the firelight. But you can feel the edge of it lying here the way you can feel the edge of sleep. And feeling the edge of it does something gentle and clarifying to the Roswell question and to all the questions like it. Against a cosmos that large, the idea that we might not be alone stops being strange at all. It becomes, if anything, the more reasonable expectation. With that many suns, that many worlds, that much time, it would be a kind of cosmic loneliness almost too vast to credit if life had happened only once, only here, only on this one warm stone among the trillions. The serious scientists who listen at their dishes are not chasing a fantasy. They are asking a question that the sheer scale of things makes entirely sober and entirely sensible. But and this is the soft and steadying truth to carry down towards sleep, that the question is reasonable does not mean any particular answer has arrived. The universe being full of possibility is not the same as a disk having crashed on a ranch outside Roswell in the summer of 1947. The two things live in different rooms. One is the grand open question that the whole sky poses to anyone who looks up. The other is a specific claim about a specific debris field on a specific morning, and that claim, as the long hours of this night have shown, dissolves quietly when you hold it to the light, into balloons and secret projects and faded memories, and the human hunger for the story to be more than it was. The dissolving of the small claim takes nothing away from the largeness of the great question. You can let go of the saucer entirely and keep the wonder whole. In fact, that is the only honest way to keep the wonder whole, to set down the things that are not true so that your hands are free to hold the things that are, and the genuine mystery of a cosmos this size is more than enough to fill them. So that is why we look up, not because the answer is hovering just out of sight, waiting to be uncovered in some government vault. We look up because we are small and the sky is large, and that proportion has been written into us since the first of our kind lay on warm ground exactly like this and felt the pull of all those distant fires. We look up because the question of whether we are alone is the most natural question a conscious creature can ask, and the sky asks it of us every clear night, silently, simply by being there. The saucer stories are one of the shapes that ancient longing took in one frightened and secretive decade, and they tell us a great deal, not about what is out there, but about what was in here, in the human heart of that particular summer. And the patient listening at the great dishes is another shape the same longing takes, a quieter and more rigorous shape, still going on tonight while you drift, still sweeping the silent frequencies, still keeping the door open just a careful crack. There is no need to resolve any of it now. The question can stay open. That is what it is for. A question this size is not a problem to be solved before you are allowed to rest. It is a thing to lie beneath, the way you are lying beneath it now, vast and quiet and undemanding, asking nothing of you tonight but that you let it be large. The dishes will go on listening. The stars will go on burning, each one a sun, in their 100 billion and their 100 billion galaxies, whether or not anyone is awake to wonder at them. And the desert will go on giving back its warmth to the dark slowly, all through the night, the way it has on every night since long before there was anyone here to feel it. Let your eyes close now if they have not already. You do not need to keep watch. The sky has kept itself for billions of years without your help and will keep itself a while longer. Let the constellations blur and run together. Let the great pale river of the Milky Way soften into a single glow and then into nothing. The warm ground holds you. The vast and patient sky holds the warm ground. And the oldest question of all, the one that pulled your face upward in the first place, settles down beside you now like something tame, no longer urgent, no longer a matter of discs or secrets or fear. Only the quiet wondering of a small creature under a large sky, drifting at last towards sleep. We are not finished with Roswell, not quite. There is one more quiet room ahead where we will sit at the end of the whole long night and ask how a person lives peacefully with a question that will not fully close. But that is for a little while from now, and there is no hurry at all to reach it. For now there is only the warm earth and the cooling air and the countless distant suns turning slowly overhead and the soft and bottomless dark coming up to meet you. Look up one last time and then let go. Sleep well. There is a building on a quiet main street in a small New Mexico town, an old movie theater from the 1930s with a tall plain front, and inside it now there are no films, only the long strange story we have been following all this night, laid out in panels and photographs and patient glass cases for anyone who cares to walk through and read. People come from all over the world to stand in that old theater, and they come not in fear but in a kind of delight in that small fact that a town took the strangest thing that ever happened to it and made of it something warm and welcoming and shared, is as good a place as any to begin the last of our walking. There is nothing here that needs to worry you. This is the gentlest part of the whole long night, the part where everything that seemed strange is set softly down, one piece at a time, until all that is left is the wide dark desert and the patient sky and the most ordinary and comforting of truths. Let the words come slowly, at whatever pace the night allows, and let yourself drift down, gently, towards sleep. For the case of Roswell in the end was formally closed, or as nearly closed as such things are ever allowed to be, and it is worth knowing, drowsily and without any need to memorize, how that closing came about, because there is comfort in it. 50 years almost to the month after the rancher gathered his strange light debris from the storm-washed grass, in the summer of 1997, the United States Air Force published a long and careful report, and they gave it a title that left little doubt about its intention. They called it the Roswell Report, Case Closed. It ran to more than 200 pages, dense with photographs and documents and old technical records, and it set out to answer the one question that the earlier accounting had not fully reached. The balloons had already been explained a few years before, the secret listening trains, the foil and the balsa sticks and the patterned tape, scattered across the pasture and made strange by their season. That much had been laid to rest. But there remained the other thread, the harder and stranger one, the thread that had grown most luxuriantly in the long retelling. There remained the bodies. Because by the 1990s the legend had bodies in it. Somewhere in the decades of telling and retelling, small figures had entered the story, figures recovered from the desert, carried away, hidden. And the Air Force, in this last report, set itself the patient task of asking where such memories might honestly have come from, if not from a fallen craft. And the answer they arrived at, after much sifting of their own old records, was at once stranger and more ordinary than the legend, and it is the kind of answer that rewards a slow and gentle hearing. In the years after the war, all through the 1950s, the same high desert that had launched the listening balloons became the testing ground for another quiet enterprise, the long effort to learn how a human being might survive a fall from the very top of the sky. The age of high flight was arriving, of aircraft that climbed into the thin cold edge of space, and the men who planned for it needed to know what would happen to a body that had to leave such a craft and come down a long way through the high air. And so they built dummies, life-sized figures shaped roughly like a man, weighted and jointed to fall as a man would fall, anthropomorphic. The records called them man-shaped, and they carried these figures up beneath great balloons into the high cold reaches and let them drop again and again, to study how they tumbled and how their parachutes opened, and how a real airman might one day be brought safely down. The work had quiet code names, as such work does. One of them was called High Dive, another Excelsior. And over those years, a great many of these man-shaped figures fell out of the New Mexico sky and were gathered up afterward from the desert floor by recovery crews who came out in trucks to collect them. Picture it softly the way you might picture any half-forgotten scene, the enormous pale sky over the desert, a small dark shape tumbling down out of it under a blossoming parachute. And then across the scrub in the sand, a truck rolling out and men climbing down, and gathering up from the ground a still and silent figure roughly the size and shape of a person. Gathering it carefully, perhaps, the way one handles something that looks unsettlingly like a body, and laying it in the back of the truck and driving away. To a rancher or a traveler who came upon such a scene from a distance and did not know what these tests were, who saw only the small bodies in the trucks and the men in uniform carrying something away across the desert, the sight might lodge in the memory as something far stranger than it was, and it might be remembered for decades, and it might, in the remembering, drift loose from its proper year. And the report went on, gently and at length, to gather up the other scattered fragments of the body legend, and to find for each of them a quiet earthly source, all from the same desert, all from the same handful of years. There had been, the records showed, real accidents in that high country in the 1950s, a balloon mishap in which an airman was badly injured and carried away in haste, his face swollen and discolored, an aircraft that came down in flames with men lost aboard it, recovery crews working under tarpaulins in the heat. Each of these had its own small store of grief, and each had been witnessed by someone, and each had left, in some memory or other, an image of broken bodies in the desert and uniformed men moving them away under cover. The report's quiet suggestion was not that any single one of these had become the legend, but that all of them together, the dummies, the injured man, the crash, the trucks and the tarpaulins and the hurried recoveries, had over the long decades drifted and merged and settled into one another, the way images do in a sleeping mind, until they made between them a single luminous false memory of small bodies gathered from a saucer. It is a strange and rather tender idea, when you sit with it, that the most haunting part of the whole legend might be not a single event misremembered, but a whole decade of ordinary sorrows softly folded together into one impossible afternoon. That last thing is the quiet heart of the whole report, and it deserves a gentle word because it is the most human part of all. The dummies fell in the 1950s. The famous summer of the discs was 1947, and between them lay the better part of a decade. How could a memory of the one be mistaken for a memory of the other across so many years? And the answer the report offered was simply this: that memory does that. The mind, looking back across a long life, tends quietly to draw its scattered marvels together, pull events nearer to one another than they truly were, to fold the years so that two strange things that happened in the same desert come to feel as though they happened in the same season. The report had a plain name for it: time compression, the gentle contracting of the past that happens to all of us as we age, the way the events of long ago lose their dates and keep only their strangeness. It is not lying. It is not even error exactly. It is only what memory does left to itself over a great span of years. It keeps the wonder and lets the calendar go. Now it is only fair, and it is in the even-handed spirit of this whole long night, to say plainly that not everyone found this last explanation satisfying, and that some found it almost too neat. The critics pointed out reasonably enough that it asked a great deal of memory, that it asked people to have folded a full decade, to have moved man-shaped dummies back across 10 years and set them down in the wrong summer. And they noted, too, that it sat a little awkwardly beside the earlier official word, which had tended to say there was nothing to the body stories at all. These are fair objections, and we need not wave them away. The dummy explanation is not a perfect key that turns smoothly in every lock. It is a reasonable account of where certain strange memories might have come from, offered in good faith, and you may weigh it as gently or as skeptically as you like, here in the dark, with nothing riding on the verdict. And that really is where the whole matter comes to rest, when you lay the documented beside the undocumented and look at the two of them quietly side by side. On the one side, the documented, the things for which there are records, papers, photographs, technical files that survive the decades and can be read today. The secret listening balloons are documented. The project was real, its purpose was real. The materials it scattered matched the debris from the pasture. The high-altitude dummy drops are documented. The figures were real, the trucks were real, the desert recoveries happened, and the men who did the work left behind their reports and their photographs and their long, earnest accounts of how the parachutes opened and how the figures fell. These things have paper behind them, and the paper can be held up to the light and turned over and read. And on the other side, the undocumented, the craft, the recovered ship, the small living bodies of the legend. For these, across 50 years and more of looking, of inquiries and government reports and the slow, patient opening of old files, no record was ever found. No document, no photograph, no technical file, no morgue ledger, no quiet memorandum, no honest paper trail of any kind. Whole inquiries went looking for it with subpoena power and open archives and came back empty-handed. The most striking thing about the heart of the legend, when you finally hold it up to the light, is how little of it casts any shadow there at all. It is worth pausing on that distinction for a slow breath or two, because it is the steadying spine of the whole long story. A legend, as it grows, does not trouble itself with paper. It lives in the telling, in the warm rooms where stories are passed from hand to hand, and it needs no archive to flourish. But the things of the world, the experiments and the accidents and the projects with their budgets and their crews, these leave a wake behind them, a long trail of ordinary documents, because that is simply what real institutions do. They write things down. And so when you go looking decades later and you find a rich and detailed paper wake behind the balloons and the dummies, and you find nothing at all behind the saucer and its crew, the contrast itself becomes a kind of quiet answer. The documented things are earthly and human and a little sad and entirely real. The unearthly things leave no mark in the record anywhere at all. That is not proof of a universal kind. The record is never quite complete, and we will honor that in a moment, but it is where the weight of the evidence honestly and unmistakably lies, and you may rest your own weight upon it tonight without the least unease. And yet, and here is the soft and lovely turn the whole story takes at its end, the town did not grieve when the case was closed. Quite the opposite. While the reports were being written and the records sifted, the small town out on the high plains was doing something altogether gentler with its strange inheritance. In the early 1990s, some years before the final report, a few of the people there opened a museum in that old movie theater on the main street, a quiet, earnest place, half exhibit and half gathering hall, where the whole story could be laid out for anyone who wished to come and wonder at it. And a few years after that, the town began to hold a festival every summer around the anniversary of that long ago July, and the festival grew until thousands of people came to it from all over the country and all over the world. They came to a town in the middle of the desert, a town that might otherwise have been only a name on a map between two long stretches of empty road, and they filled its streets, and they wore strange costumes, and they laughed, and they looked up at the same enormous sky the rancher had looked up at, and they had, by every account, a wonderful time. There is something deeply touching in that when you let it reach you. The town was not asked to believe anything in particular. It was not asked to insist that a ship had fallen, nor to insist that nothing had. It simply took the open question, the great soft unanswered thing that had drifted down out of its sky, and it made of that question a place to gather, a reason to come together, a shared and gentle wonder that asked nothing of anyone except the willingness to look up. The legend, which might have been a wound or a quarrel, became instead a kind of warmth. And the museum itself, that quiet, earnest place in the old theater, became something its founders perhaps never quite intended, not a shrine to belief, but a kind of library of the whole strange story, with room enough on its walls for every side of it. The reports are there, the skeptical accounts beside the believing ones, the documents of the balloons and the dummies set out plainly for anyone who cares to read them, alongside the testimonies and the wonderings in the old newspaper pages. People file through it slowly, the way one moves through any place that asks you to think, and they argue gently among themselves, and they look at the same evidence and come away holding different things, and somehow none of it spoils the visit. And then in the high summer they come in their thousands for the festival, and the whole small town gives itself over to it, costumes in the streets, lights strung up, lectures in the afternoons and music in the evenings, children with painted faces, strangers from far countries all laughing under the same enormous desert sky. It is a strange and lovely thing to behold, a community that took the most unanswerable question ever set down in its midst, and rather than letting it divide them, made of it a yearly festival of welcome. That, perhaps more than any report, is the truest closing of the case, not a verdict handed down from above, but a whole community deciding, quietly and without fuss, that it could live happily alongside a mystery it would never fully solve, and even love it a little for staying open. For that is the gentlest gift this whole long story has to give us in the end, not an answer about the sky, but the quiet art of living at peace with a question that has none. We are taught in the loud daytime world that every question must have its answer, that we must come down hard on one side or the other, that to remain unsure is to be unfinished, uneasy, somehow at fault, but it is not so. There is a way of holding an open question that is not anxious in the least, a way of letting it lie in the mind like a smooth, cool stone in the palm, turning it over now and then with mild and easy curiosity and asking nothing more of it. What truly fell across that pasture in every last particular? We are very nearly sure and not quite perfectly certain, and that is a fine and restful place for a thing to be. We have followed the weight of the record to its likely end, a fallen secret, made strange by its season and stranger in the long retelling, and we have let the small, honest remainder of doubt stay where it is, unchased, untroubling, like a faint star at the edge of vision that you need not turn your head to see. Are we alone beneath this enormous sky, or is there something somewhere looking back across the vast, cold distances at the small, bright world that we are? We do not know. We may not know for a very long time, perhaps not in our lives at all. And both of these questions may simply stay open, unforced, unhurried, held lightly in the loosening hand while we rest. The open question is not a danger. It is only a door left gently ajar with the soft dark beyond it, and you need not walk through it tonight, nor close it, nor stand guard before it. You may simply let it stand open and turn away from it, and lie down and sleep. And there is something more here than mere peace. There is a kind of spaciousness in it, a room in the mind with the windows open and the cool night air moving softly through. For to live easily among open questions is to keep the world wide, to keep it roomy and unfinished and full of soft possibility, without ever losing your footing on the firm ground of what is actually known. It is to hold the real vastness of the sky and the real smallness of the pasture both at once, to let the great wonder live overhead, while the small earthly tale rests quietly on the ground, and to be untroubled by either. The world is large enough to hold both the wonder and the plain truth without strain, and so are you. You may carry your awe at that immense, honest sky, and your clear-eyed calm about a long-grown legend together, gently in the very same quiet heart, and feel no contradiction in it at all. So let us gather the whole of it now, drowsily, the way one tidies a room before bed, and lay each piece of it softly down to rest. Think back, half dreaming, over the country we have crossed these long hours. There is nothing to hold, only a few faint images to let drift past as they fade. The wide, high desert under its enormous sky, the small, far lights of an ordinary town at the edge of the dark. The discontented summer of 1947, the whole tired country 2 years out of a great war with its head tipped back, watching the blue. The rancher in the early light, gathering a scatter of strange light debris from the storm-washed grass. The great headline in its swift correction, the disc announced and unsaid in a single afternoon. The secret listening balloons of the frightened atomic age, foil and balsa stick and gray, torn rubber and patterned tape, fallen from the high, cold sky. The long decades of forgetting and the strange, slow waking, the small thing grown into a vast legend across the years. The man-shaped figures tumbling down out of the 1950 sky, and the trucks crossing the scrub to gather them. The soft, tireless work of memory folding the years together, drawing the marvels near. The old theater on the main street, and the streets full of laughing strangers on a summer afternoon. And above all of it, the great real sky, vast past imagining, holding its old, honest, open question. That is the whole of it. That is the night we have walked. And now the walking is done, all of it, and there is nowhere left to go, and nothing left to reach. So let it all lie quiet now, the whole of it, as we come at last to the close of our night. Let the wide desert lie dark beneath its enormous sky, the small town sleeping, the pasture empty and still. Let the discs of that long-ago summer drift on out of memory. Let the great headline rest, and the quiet correction beside it. Let the secret balloons lie broken and forgotten where they fell, their listening long since done. Let the man-shaped figures rest in whatever drawer of the past memory has folded them into, harming no one, only sleeping. Let the old theater stand dark and locked for the night with all its patient story safe inside. Let the festival crowds go home to their beds. Let the legend go on telling itself softly out there in the wide world, growing or resting as it will, asking nothing of you. And let the great real sky keep its old open question, patient and unanswered, far up in the patient dark, where it has always been and where it will always be, needing nothing from you, troubling you not at all. There is nothing left to ask tonight, and nothing left to wonder, and nothing left to do. The story holds itself together without you, as it has for the better part of 100 years, and it will hold a while longer yet while you rest. You have walked a long, long way tonight across the desert and across the decades, through the debris and the headlines and the soft, strange workings of the mind, all the way up to the vast and crowded stars, and now the walking is wholly done, and there is nowhere left to go, and no question left to hold, and no answer left to find. Let your breath go slow and deep and easy, like the slow breathing of the sleeping land. Let every thought you carried out into the night settle softly down into the stillness, like dust settling on the dark pasture grass, and grow quiet and grow faint and let go. And so, with the whole gentle mystery laid down around you, and the great sky turning slow and silent overhead, and the dry, sweet stillness of the desert folded close about you like the softest of blankets, let yourself sink down now, all the way down, gently and completely, with nothing to hold and nothing to keep and nothing at all to settle, down past the last of your waking thoughts, down past the open question left softly ajar, down into the warm and patient dark, down and softly. Softly down into sleep, rest now, sleep well. The sky keeps its watch, and you may let go of yours. Good night.